Think of our national parks. What comes to mind? Towering trees, majestic mountains, the quiet serenity of nature. It's the place we go to escape, to find peace. But for the men and women who work there, the forest rangers, these vast wilderness areas hold a different reality. They see what happens when the sun goes down, what lurks just off the marked trails, and what the beautiful landscapes can hide. They are the first on the scene for a missing person report, the ones who follow tracks that lead to nowhere, and the keepers of stories that defy easy explanation. Stories that will make you think twice before you next step into the woods alone. Today we're sharing a collection of true, terrifying stories from park rangers across the country. These aren't campfire tales, they are first-hand accounts of encounters that are strange, unsettling, and will absolutely give you chills. So, turn down the lights and get ready to hear what truly happens in the wild. My name is Scout Cromwell, and for the better part of 15 years, I've served as a park ranger. It isn't just a job, it's a calling, a symbiotic relationship with the wilderness that I swore to protect. My jurisdiction is a sprawling expanse of dense, old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, a place where the trees are titans that have stood sentinel for centuries, their canopies so thick they weave a permanent twilight on the forest floor. I've always found comfort in the solitude, in the ancient whispers of the wind through pine and cedar. I've tracked cougars, faced down territorial black bears, and dealt with my fair share of lost hikers and reckless campers. I thought I had seen and understood the full spectrum of what these woods could throw at me. I was wrong. The forest has secrets older and deeper than any map can show, and I was about to stumble into one of them. The day began like any other. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying pine needles, a perfume I'd come to associate with home. My assignment was a routine boundary patrol on the far western edge of the park, a section rarely visited by tourists. It's a rugged, untamed area where the trails are little more than suggestions, game paths that weave through thick underbrush and over moss, slicked logs. My companion was my trusted German shepherd, Ranger, a loyal and intelligent dog whose senses were far sharper than my own. With Ranger trotting confidently ahead and the familiar weight of the pack on my shoulders, I felt a sense of calm purpose. The agenda was simple: check the boundary markers, look for signs of illegal poaching or logging, and generally ensure the sanctity of the park's border was intact. It was a multi-day trek, and I was well supplied for a week in the wilderness. For the first few hours, the patrol was uneventful. The forest hummed with its usual symphony, the chatter of squirrels, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the rustle of unseen creatures in the ferns. Ranger would occasionally pause, his ears perked, sniffing the air, but his body language remained relaxed. We followed the meandering creek that served as a natural guide, its gurgling a constant, soothing soundtrack to our journey. The sun, distant, shimmering disk, struggled to pierce the canopy, casting down dappled light that danced on the forest floor. It was in these moments, surrounded by the raw, unfiltered beauty of nature, that I felt most alive. I felt a profound connection to this place, a sense of belonging that the civilized world could never offer. It was just after midday when the first subtle sign of wrongness appeared. It wasn't something you'd see or hear, but something you'd feel. The ambient noise of the forest began to fade. The bird songs dwindled, the insect buzz quieted, and the rustling in the undergrowth ceased. It happened gradually, a slow draining of sound until an unnerving silence descended. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet, the kind that precedes a storm or the arrival of a major predator. Every veteran woodsman knows this silence. It's a primal alarm bell. Ranger felt it too. He stopped dead in his tracks, the fur on his neck bristling. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound I rarely heard from him. He pressed against my leg, his body tense, his eyes scanning the dense woods around us. I placed a calming hand on his head, my own senses now on high alert. My heart began to beat a little faster, my hand instinctively moving closer to the holstered sidearm on my hip. Easy, boy. I whispered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. "What is it?" My first thought was a cougar, or perhaps a bear. We were in their territory. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement, any shape that was out of place. I listened, straining my ears for the snap of a twig, the huff of breath. But there was nothing. Just the silence, thick and absolute. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. We stood like that for several minutes, a pair of statues in a silent, green world. The feeling of being watched was palpable, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It's a cliche, I know, but the feeling was undeniable. Eyes were on us. I decided against staying put. Being a stationary target felt unwise. We had to keep moving to get out of this zone of silence. I gave Ranger a gentle nudge, and we continued our patrol, but our pace was now slower, more cautious. The sense of routine had vanished, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. We walked for another half-mile before I saw it. To the side of the faint trail, near the base of a colossal, gnarled cedar that had to be centuries old, the ground was disturbed. My ranger training kicked in, momentarily overriding the fear. I was drawn to it out of professional curiosity. Poachers, an illegal campsite. I motioned for Ranger to stay, and he obeyed, though his low growl never ceased. As I drew closer, I realized it wasn't a campsite. It was a single impression in the damp, loamy soil. I knelt down, my eyes widening in disbelief. It was a footprint, but it was unlike any footprint I had ever seen. My mind raced, trying to categorize it, to fit it into a known box. Beer.
No.
A black bear's print is distinct, with 5 toes and claw marks. This had no claw marks. The shape was all wrong. A hoax. Someone with a novelty oversized shoe. Unlikely. We were miles from any accessible road, in a part of the park few people ever ventured into. To come all this way for a prank seemed absurd. The print was immense, easily 20 inches long and nearly as wide. But its size wasn't the most disturbing feature. It was its shape. It was almost perfectly circular. Not oval like a human's, but round. The indentation was deep, at least 3 inches into the firm soil, suggesting that whatever made it possessed an incredible weight. I could see the faint outlines of what might have been 5 thick, stubby toes at one edge, but the overall impression was unnervingly round. The soil was damp from the morning dew, making the print impossibly pristine. The edges were sharp and clear, indicating it had been made very recently. And yet, there was only one. I scanned the entire area in a wide circle. There were no other tracks, no entry trail, no exit trail. Just this single, giant, circular footprint pressed into the earth, as if the creature had descended from the sky, touched the ground once, and then vanished. It made no logical sense. The physics of it were impossible. An animal with that much weight would leave a trail, especially on this soft ground. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and touched the edge of the print. The soil was cool and firm. This was real. This wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. The oppressive silence of the forest suddenly felt more sinister, more personal. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I felt a surge of pure, primal fear, the kind that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to the ancient, vulnerable parts of the brain. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I slowly stood up, my hand now gripping the cold steel of my firearm. I was no longer a ranger on patrol. I was prey. My eyes darted around the dense, silent woods. The towering trees, which had always felt like protective sentinels, now seemed like colossal, indifferent tombstones in a vast, green graveyard. Every dark space between the trunks seemed to hold a lurking shape, a pair of unseen eyes. I backed away from the print slowly, my boots making no sound on the mossy ground. I called Ranger to my side, my voice a strained whisper. He was still growling, his gaze fixed on a particularly dense thicket of ferns and shadows about 50 yards away, and that's when I heard it. It was faint, carried on the still air from the direction Ranger was staring. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was a low, guttural, resonant sound, almost like a cross between a deep hum and a sigh. It was a sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was followed by the loud, Sharp crack of a massive tree branch snapping, a sound that required immense force. Far more force than a bear or a man could produce. The blood drained from my face. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we were not alone. Whatever had made that impossible footprint was still here. It was close, and it was watching us. My training, my experience, my rational mind, all of it screamed at me to run. For the first time in my long career, I was truly, deeply terrified of the woods I had always called home. Flight. That was the only instinct, the only command my brain could produce. Pure, undiluted terror had seized control, and it screamed at me to turn and run, to not look back, to leave this accursed place behind. But 15 years of training, of drilling discipline into my very marrow fought back. You don't run blindly in the wilderness. That's how you get lost. That's how you get hurt. That's how you die. I forced a breath into my lungs, the air feeling thin and sharp. I had to think. I had to make a plan. My hand was slick with sweat on the grip of my pistol. The low growl from Ranger beside me was the only thing that grounded me, a familiar anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Retreat. Not a panicked flight, but a tactical withdrawal. Back the way we came. Stick to the creek. Don't lose your bearings. My mind clicked through the steps, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos churning in my gut. Okay, boy, I whispered, my voice barely a crackle. We're leaving. Let's go. Slow and steady. I started backing away, my eyes locked on the dense thicket where the sound had originated. I didn't dare turn my back on it. Ranger moved with me, a synchronized shadow of tense muscle and bared teeth. We retreated step by agonizing step, moving backward over the moss and roots. The silence persisted, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound except for my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague sensation. It was a physical pressure, as if the air itself was condensing around us. Every fiber of my being wanted to break into a sprint, but I held on, forcing a measured pace. After about 100 yards of this painstaking reverse march, I risked turning around. I scooped up my pack, which I dropped near the impossible footprint, never taking my eyes off the woods for more than a second. With the pack settled, I turned fully and began to walk, quickly but deliberately, back along our own trail. Ranger stayed close, practically glued to my side, his head on a constant, nervous swivel. We had been moving for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes when a new sound broke the silence. It was a sharp thwack from somewhere to our right, followed by the rustle of leaves. I spun around, weapon raised, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Then another thwack, this time to our left, closer. It sounded like a rock hitting a tree. A warning, a display of aggression. Then I saw it. A stone about the size of my fist sailed through the air in a high arc and landed on the path a dozen feet ahead of us with a soft thud. It hadn't fallen. It had been thrown with considerable force and accuracy. Ranger let out a series of sharp, furious barks. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a passive presence anymore. It was interacting with us. It was hurting us or toying with us. I couldn't decide which was worse. We picked up the pace, breaking into a steady trot. The dignity of a tactical retreat was gone. Now we were being driven. The forest, my sanctuary, had transformed into a labyrinth designed by a malevolent intelligence. The familiar trees now seemed to lean in, their branches like grasping claws. The dappled sunlight that had been so beautiful just hours before now seemed to create treacherous illusions, hiding movement in every patch of shadow. My mind started playing tricks on me. I kept catching glimpses of motion in my peripheral vision. A flicker of darkness, a shape too tall to be a deer, a hulking form that vanished the moment I turned to look directly at it. The rock throwing continued intermittently. A stone would whistle past my head or land, just behind my heels. It was unnervingly precise, never hitting us, but always close enough to keep the terror fresh and potent. It felt calculated, a form of psychological warfare. It was a demonstration of strength and accuracy, a constant reminder that it could strike us whenever it chose. We were utterly at its mercy. The low, resonant hum we'd heard earlier returned, this time closer, seemingly coming from multiple directions at once. It would rise and fall in pitch, an eerie, mournful sound that vibrated through the soles of my boots. It was a vocalization, I was sure of it, but it was unlike any animal call. It was complex, layered. It sounded less like a beast and more like a lament, a deep-chested expression of something ancient and sorrowful. But there was a menace in it, too. A territorial claim. This is my home. You are not welcome. Hours bled into one another. My body was running on pure adrenaline, my muscles aching with tension. The sun began its slow descent, the light in the understory shifting from a dim green to a hazy orange, then to a deep, foreboding blue. The impending dusk brought a new level of fear. To be caught out here, in the dark, with this thing, it was a thought I couldn't allow myself to entertain. My station, my truck, the world of logic and reason, felt a million miles away. We finally stumbled into a small clearing I recognized, a place where I had camped once before years ago. There was a small, flat patch of ground near the creek. My original plan had been to push on for another 2 hours to a more established campsite, but I knew we wouldn't make it. My legs were trembling with exhaustion, and the fading light was making the trail treacherous. We had to stop. We had to make camp. The decision felt like a death sentence. Setting up my small, one-man tent, I felt terribly exposed. The thin nylon walls offered no real protection, only the illusion of it. I worked quickly, my movements jerky and inefficient. I gathered firewood, my eyes constantly scanning the darkening perimeter of the clearing. Ranger sat on his haunches, a silent, furry sentinel, his gaze never wavering from the tree line. He refused to relax, refused to even lie down. I got a fire going, coaxing the flames to life with shaking hands. The fire crackled and spat, pushing back the darkness and creating a small bubble of warmth and light. In any other circumstance, it would have been a comforting sight. Tonight, it felt like a beacon, advertising our presence to the monster in the woods. But being in total darkness was an even more terrifying prospect. As I huddled by the fire, trying to force down a tasteless protein bar, the forest came alive with a new chorus of sounds. The humming had stopped. It was replaced by a series of deep, guttural clicks and whistles. Then came a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was a powerful, a call that echoed through the valley, filled with power and a strange, almost bird-like quality. It was answered by another whoop from a different direction. There wasn't just one. There were at least 2 of them, communicating with each other, coordinating. They were closing in. Suddenly, a heavy object slammed into the ground, just outside the ring of firelight, maybe 30 feet from where I sat. It hit with a tremendous thump that shook the earth. I scrambled to my feet, my pistol in my hand, aiming the barrel into the impenetrable darkness. Ranger was barking himself hoarse, a frantic, desperate sound. I shone my powerful headlamp in the direction of the impact. Lying in the grass was a massive log, at least 6 feet long and as thick as my thigh. It hadn't rolled there. The ground was flat. It had been thrown with the kind of impossible, superhuman strength needed to hurl a small tree trunk. My mind finally broke. The last vestiges of my ranger's composure crumbled into dust. This wasn't a cryptid or a legend. This was a nightmare made real, an intelligent, impossibly strong creature that was actively hunting us. It was showing off, demonstrating its power, terrorizing us before the final act. I was a rat in a cage, and the keepers were growing bored of their game. I grabbed my pack and kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the clearing into near total darkness, save for the weak beam of my headlamp. The sounds were closer now, the whistles and clicks coming from just beyond the creek. I could hear heavy, bipedal footsteps crunching on the forest floor. Not the steps of a bear or a deer. These were the heavy, deliberate footfalls of something that walked on 2 legs. Something massive. Ranger was going berserk, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness was absolute. I stood back with my dog, slowly turning in a circle, my headlamp beam cutting a frantic, useless path through the gloom. The footsteps stopped. The clicks and whistles fell silent. The oppressive, heavy silence returned, more terrifying than the sounds had been. We were surrounded. They were here, waiting, watching. And as I stood there, trembling in the dark, I knew with a chilling certainty that the night was just beginning. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound I had heard that night. It was a perfect silence, a vacuum into which all noise was absorbed. I stood frozen, my back against Ranger, my dog, who trembled uncontrollably but no longer barked. He could only manage a low, guttural growl deep in his throat. The beam from my headlamp darted aimlessly through the darkness, a tiny needle trying to pierce an endless black velvet cloth. Each second stretched into an eternity. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I smelled it, a powerful and indescribable odor. It was the rank smell of damp fur, mingled with the scent of rotting earth and the sharp, metallic tang of old blood. It was the smell of a wild animal, of a predator, but there was something different about it, a scent that churned my stomach. It drifted from every direction, surrounding us like an invisible wall. Ranger began to whimper, a sound of pure terror. I had never heard such a noise from him before, not when facing grizzly bears or mountain lions. It was the sound of an animal that knew it had met the apex predator at the very top of the food chain. Suddenly, I heard breathing. A deep, heavy breath, like a massive bellows at work. It was close, alarmingly close, just a few steps beyond the stream. I slowly, deliberately, turned my light toward the source of the sound, the hand holding my pistol shaking uncontrollably. My beam caught only a glimpse, but that image would be seared into my nightmares forever. It was not a bear, not any animal I knew. It stood on two legs, towering, its colossal form obscuring the trees behind it. Long, coarse, jet black fur covered its entire body. But what nearly drove me to madness were its eyes. Two eyes reflected my headlamp's beam, eyes that smoldered with a deep red glow, like embers in a fire. There was no animalistic gleam in them. It was the gaze of an intelligent, malevolent being filled with an ultimate hatred and vengefulness. We made eye contact for only a fraction of a second, but in that instant, I felt as if it saw straight into my soul, witnessed all my fears, and was pleased by what it saw. The creature moved. It stepped out of the shadows, revealing its full form. It was at least 8 feet tall. Every muscle on its body bulged beneath the thick fur. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging nearly to its knees, its massive hands clenched into fists at its sides. It crossed the small stream as if it weren't even there and stopped less than 20 feet from me. The gun in my hand felt as light and useless as a child's toy. What could a .45 caliber bullet do against this monster? But I had to do something. I raised the pistol, aiming for the center of its chest, my finger on the trigger. "Get back!" I yelled, my voice trembling and hoarse. "Get back." It didn't respond. It just stared at me with those red eyes. Then it opened its mouth, revealing a row of yellowed teeth that looked strong enough to grind bone into dust. But it didn't roar. It emitted a sound, a deep, resonant clicking from its throat. The same sound I had heard earlier. Then it slowly raised one arm, pointing a long finger at me. Before I could react, a piercing scream erupted from behind me. A scream of agony and terror. I whipped around. "Ranger!" My dog was airborne, snatched by another massive hand that had emerged from the darkness. There was another one. It had ambushed us from behind. Everything happened so fast. The second creature, whose form I couldn't clearly see in the gloom, slammed Ranger's body against a nearby tree with brutal force. I heard the sickening crack of breaking bones, and his cries were silenced instantly. The lifeless body of my faithful friend fell to the ground like a rag doll. A burning rage completely extinguished my fear. All thought vanished, leaving only raw instinct. "You bastard!" I roared and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed thunderously in the silence. A muzzle flash lit the night. I fired once, twice, 3 times, emptying the clip into the colossal figure before me. The bullet struck home. I saw its fur ripple and heard the dull thud as they buried themselves in thick muscle. It roared then, a roar of pain and fury that shook the entire forest. But instead of falling, it only grew more enraged. It charged at me with a speed unbelievable for a creature of its size. I had no time to fire again. Its massive hand swatted the gun from my grasp with ease, the impact leaving my fingers numb. Then that same hand seized my chest, lifting me off the ground as if I were a cloth doll. I felt an immense pressure, my ribs on the verge of shattering. The air was squeezed from my lungs. I struggled desperately, beating futilely against its arm. It was like punching a stone wall. I stared into the fiery red eyes, less than a foot from my face. The foul stench of its breath washed over me, nearly making me gag. In that moment, I accepted my fate. I was going to die here, in the forest I loved, at the hands of a demon from a primeval age. But then, the unexpected happened. A powerful whoop sounded again, this time from much farther away. It was a different sound, almost like an alarm or a call to retreat. The monster holding me froze. It turned its massive head toward the sound, growling back with clear displeasure. It still held me tight, but its attention had shifted. It met my eyes one last time. In its gaze, I saw a flicker of hesitation before it made its decision. It let out one final, deafening roar, and then violently threw me aside. I flew through the air and slammed into the ground, my head striking a root. Pain exploded through my body, and my consciousness faded to black. Drifting into darkness, I could hear the heavy footsteps of the two monsters running away, the sound of breaking branches, and their fading roars disappearing into the depths of the forest. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, the first light of dawn was filtering through the canopy in dull gray shafts. Every part of my body ached. I tried to stand but could only cry out in pain. Several of my ribs were likely broken. I slowly propped myself up against a tree. I looked around the clearing. In the dim morning light, it looked like a battlefield. The ground was littered with enormous footprints and signs of a struggle. Then my eyes fell on the small, still form lying not far away, Ranger. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. I had lost my best friend. I gathered all the courage and strength I had left. I knew I couldn't stay here. They might come back. I had to get out. I crawled to my backpack and the pistol that lay on the ground. I didn't bother with the tent or any other gear. I left it all behind. I gave Ranger's body one last look. "Goodbye, my friend," I whispered. Then I began the agonizing journey back to the world I once knew. The trek back was a nightmare of pain and grief. Every step was torture, but the fear of their return spurred me on. I didn't rest, drink, or eat. I just kept moving forward. Finally, that afternoon, I reached the dirt road that led to the park headquarters. I must have looked like a ghost. Clothes torn, covered in blood and mud. A truck driver who passed by found me and rushed me to the hospital. I told everyone I was attacked by a bear. It was the easiest explanation. No one would have believed the truth. Even I, at times, wonder if it was all a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But then I look at the scars on my chest, and I feel the emptiness where Ranger used to be, and I know that it was real. I never went back into that deep forest again. I resigned from my position as a park ranger a few months later. I couldn't bear to be in a place that was once my home, but had now become my friend's grave and the haunt of my nightmares. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear that resonant roar in my memory and see those smoldering red eyes in the dark. The forest still holds its secrets, and some secrets are best left undisturbed. My name is Quinn Ledger, and for 15 years, my world has been defined by the fine line between life and death. As a search and rescue officer operating in the rugged backcountry of the Pacific Northwest, I've been trained to read the silent language of the wilderness, the subtle story told by a broken twig, a scuff mark on a rock, or the unnatural silence that precedes a storm. I am a man of logic, of maps, and of methodical procedure. My job is to find the lost, to bring them home. Sometimes we succeed. Sometimes we only bring back closure. But in all my years, I had never encountered a situation that so thoroughly dismantled my understanding of the world until the search for Ethan Hayes. The call came on a Tuesday, under the kind of flat, gray sky that leaches the color from everything. Ethan, a 22-year-old amateur geologist, had gone for a day, hiked 3 days prior, and never returned. His car was found parked at the trailhead leading into the Whispering Karst, a notoriously complex network of limestone caves and sinkholes that even experienced spelunkers treat with a healthy dose of fear. It's a place that swallows sound and plays tricks on your eyes. The rangers call it the Whispering Karst because the wind, funneled through countless unseen fissures in the rock, often creates sounds that mimic human whispers. It's a detail you try to forget when you're 100 feet below the surface. Initial aerial and ground searches of the surrounding forest had yielded nothing. No tracks, no dropped equipment, no sign of him whatsoever. The grim but logical conclusion was that he had gone into the caves. He was equipped for a day hike, not a subterranean expedition. He had no helmet, no specialized lights beyond a standard headlamp, and most critically, no line. Going into a cave system like the Karst without a guideline is a death sentence. It's not a matter of if you'll get lost, but when. My role was specific. As the team's caving specialist, I was tasked with the preliminary sweep. This wasn't a full-scale rescue operation just yet. It was a reconnaissance mission. I was to enter the main cave opening, follow any immediate signs of passage, and map out the first few hundred yards to determine if a larger team was needed. It was a calculated risk. Sending a full team in blind is inefficient and dangerous. I was to be the tip of the spear, the eyes and ears that would guide the main effort. I stood at the mouth of the cave, a jagged wound in the side of a moss-covered hill. The air that breathed out of it was cold and carried the ancient, damp scent of wet stone and decay. It was a stark contrast to the humid pine, scented air of the forest. My gear felt reassuringly heavy on my back ropes, carabiners, extra batteries, emergency rations, and a powerful primary lamp on my helmet that cut a brilliant white circle out of the oppressive darkness. After a final check of my radio, which I knew would be useless more than 50 feet in, I took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold from the world of the living into the throat of the earth. The transition was immediate. The ambient sounds of the forest, the birds, the wind in the trees, vanished, replaced by an intense, profound silence. The only sounds were my own, the crunch of my boots on the gravel, strewn floor, the rhythmic rasp of my breathing, the soft rustle of my gear. My headlamp beam sliced through the blackness, revealing a passage that was wider than it looked from the outside, the walls a tapestry of gray and tan rock, slick with moisture that glistened like a coat of oil. The first 50 yards were straightforward. The floor was relatively level, and the path was clear. It was here I found the first sign of Ethan. A single, distinct boot print in a patch of damp clay, pointing inwards. It matched the brand his family had described. My heart rate, already elevated by the environment, gave a hopeful little kick. He came this way. I was on the right path. I moved deeper, the passage beginning to narrow. The walls closed in, forcing me to turn sideways in some spots, my pack scraping against the rough limestone. The silence was a physical presence now, pressing in on my eardrums. It's a strange thing, that kind of quiet. You start to hear the internal workings of your own body, the thumping of your heart, the faint whoosh of blood in your ears. It's in that silence that the Whispering Karst begins to earn its name. I heard the first one a few minutes later, a soft, sibilant hiss that seemed to come from the rock right next to my ear. It was just the wind, I told myself. Air moving through a pressure gradient. I've heard it 1,000 times, but it was the quality of the sound. It was too close, too defined. It sounded less like wind and more like an exhale. I ignored it and pushed on, my training taking over. Grid search mentality. Look for evidence, follow the trail, ignore the distractions. The passage opened into a larger chamber, a cathedral of stone sculpted by millennia of dripping water. Stalactites, thin and sharp as needles, hung from the ceiling. Thick columns of stalagmites rose from the floor to meet them. It was a place of alien beauty, but my light revealed something that didn't belong. Near the center of the chamber, next to a small, clear pool of water, was a high-end water bottle, identical to the one Ethan's parents had shown me in a photo. It was another good sign, but also a troubling one. Why leave it here? The chamber was a natural resting spot. Maybe he set it down for a drink and forgot it. Possible. But SAR work teaches you to be paranoid, to question everything. The placement felt staged. Too perfect. As I logged the position of the bottle, I heard another sound. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was the distinct clatter of a small stone falling, somewhere behind me, back down the passage I had just cleared. I froze, killing my light. The darkness was absolute, a physical entity that felt like it was being poured into my eyes. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Just the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the chamber. I waited a full 2 minutes, every nerve ending screaming. Was it an animal? Unlikely this deep in. Was the cave settling? Always a possibility. Or was something shadowing me? I switched my light back on, sweeping the beam back the way I came. The passage was empty. The air was still. I shook my head, chiding myself. The isolation was getting to me. That's all it was. I continued my sweep of the chamber. On the far side, the path forward forked. One passage went left, a wide and inviting opening. The other went right, a tight, low crawl space that looked far less appealing. Ethan's tracks, faint but still visible in the damp earth, led clearly towards the crawl space on the right. It made no sense. He was a casual hiker, not a caver. Why would he choose the most difficult, dangerous path? Against every instinct for self-preservation, he had chosen to crawl into that tight, dark hole. My job was to follow. Getting down on my hands and knees, I felt a wave of claustrophobia, a rare and unwelcome sensation. The crawl space was maybe 3 feet high. I had to push my pack ahead of me, inching forward on my elbows and knees. The rock was cold and unforgiving against my body. Every scrape of my gear, every grunt of exertion, sounded deafeningly loud in the confined space. This was the part of the job that no one saw, the gritty, terrifying reality of searching for someone in the guts of the earth. After what felt like an eternity, the crawl space opened into another passage, this one tall and narrow, like a fissure that had been violently split open. I stood up, stretching my aching back, and played my light along the walls. And that's when the logical, ordered world I inhabited finally began to crumble. The tracks were here, clear as day, but they led directly to a solid wall of rock at the end of the passage. A dead end. There was no way through, no other tunnels, no fissures big enough for a child to squeeze through. It was an unequivocal, solid wall of limestone. Ethan Hayes' footprints walked directly to this spot and then simply stopped. I stood there, confused, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. It was impossible. People don't just vanish. I ran my hands over the rock face, searching for a hidden opening, a trick of the light. Nothing. It was as solid as a mountain. I was about to key my radio to report the dead end and the baffling disappearance of the trail when I heard it. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a rock falling. It was a voice. A man's voice, choked with fear and exhaustion. Help, pleases. Is someone there?
Help me.
My blood turned to ice. My breath hitched in my throat. I had listened to a recording of Ethan's voice from a family video during the briefing to help with voice call outs. I knew that voice, and the one I was hearing now was identical in every way. The pitch, the tone, the desperate inflection. It was Ethan Hayes, and it was coming from right in front of me, from the other side of the solid rock wall. For a long moment, my mind refused to process the information. The training of 15 years screamed that this was an auditory illusion, a trick of acoustics in a complex cave system. Voices can bounce echo and be distorted by rock formations, making them seem to come from impossible directions. Logic, my oldest and most trusted friend, fought to assert itself against the raw, primal fear chilling my veins. There had to be another passage, a hidden fissure, a road I had missed.
Ethan, this is search and rescue.
Can you hear me? I shouted, my voice sounding thin and brittle against the immense stone. I pressed my ear against the cold, damp wall.
Talk to me!
Where are you? The reply was almost immediate, and its clarity was what terrified me the most. I'm here! Right here! Oh God, I'm so glad you found me. I'm trapped. My leg is hurt. It was Ethan's voice laced with a convincing cocktail of relief and pain. But the sound wasn't muffled, as it should have been if it were traveling through yards of solid rock. It was pristine, sharp, as if he were standing just inches away, separated only by a thin veil, and it was coming from everywhere at once. From the wall in front of me, from the ceiling above, from the floor beneath my boots. The entire dead and passage had become a speaker, broadcasting his terror. My SAR training took over, a series of automatic responses drilled into me. Stay calm, Ethan. We're going to get you out of there. Can you tell me what happened? I kept my tone even, professional, betraying none of the vertigo that was threatening to upend my sanity. While I talked, I pounded my fist against the rock face. The thud was dull, final. It was solid. There was no hollow echo, no vibration to suggest a chamber beyond. It was like knocking on the side of a mountain. I fell, the voice replied. I was trying to squeeze through a passage, and the rock gave way. My leg, I think it's broken. I can't move. Every word was perfectly articulated, every pained gasp chillingly authentic. I'm pounding on the wall in front of me, Ethan. Can you hear it? Can you give me a knockback? I slammed my fist against the limestone again, a hard, rhythmic 3 knocks, a beat of silence. Then, from the rock, came a sound that made my heart stop. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of a human fist on the other side. It was a perfect resonant mimicry of my own knocking, identical in cadence and force, sounding as if it came from my side of the wall. It was a direct, impossible reply. Did you hear that? Ethan's voice asked, a note of fresh panic in it. What was that sound? My blood ran cold. The voice was playing a part. The voice was the trapper, and I was the prey. It was not Ethan. Ethan was the bait. This thing, whatever it was a performer. It was mimicking a victim to draw me in, and now it was mimicking me to unnerve me, to toy with me. The realization was a physical blow. The air grew thick and heavy, and the profound silence I'd felt earlier now seemed like a held breath, the expectant hush of a predator before it strikes. I backed away from the wall slowly, my headlamp beam trembling. Who is this? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, a new sound began. It came from behind me, from the direction of the crawl space I had just exited. It was a whisper, a soft, conspiratorial hiss, and it was my own voice. The isolation is getting to me, it whispered. That's all it was. It was a perfect playback of the thought I'd had in the large chamber. Not just my words, but my exact tone, the precise inflection of my own self-reassurance. My thoughts were no longer private. The cave wasn't just whispering with the wind, it was whispering with me. It was inside my head. Panic, cold and absolute, finally broke through the dam of my training. This was not a rescue. This was a haunting. I turned and scrambled back towards the crawl space, my methodical search forgotten, replaced by a singular, primal urge escape. I threw myself to the ground, shoving my pack ahead of me, not caring about the noise or the scrapes. The crawl space felt tighter now, the rock walls like the tightening jaws of a vise. I imagined the thing behind me, flowing through the solid rock like water, its formless body twisting to match the sound of my terror. As I pushed my way through the narrow tunnel, the sounds changed. I no longer heard Ethan's cries for help. Instead, I heard my own name. Quinn? It called in the gentle, loving voice of my wife. Sarah, what are you doing? Come back. It was so perfect, so heartbreakingly accurate, that for a split second, I froze. My mind knew it was a lie, a cruel trick, but my heart ached to believe it. Then, the voice shifted again, this time to the gruff, commanding tone of my first SAR captain, a man who had been dead for 5 years. Ledger, hold your position. That's an order. It was plundering my memories, using the voices of those I loved and respected against me. It wasn't just a mimic. It was a parasite that fed on emotion and memory. I squeezed my eyes shut and pushed harder, my grunts of effort mixing with the phantom voices that echoed in the tight space. I was no longer a rescuer. I was a man fleeing a ghost that knew his soul. I burst out of the crawl space and back into the large, cathedral-like chamber, scrambling to my feet. My light darted around wildly, a frantic search for threats that had no physical form. The chamber was the same as I had left it. The pool of still water, the dripping stalactites, and the water bottle. But something was different. Something new was there. Next to Ethan's water bottle, placed neatly on a flat, dry patch of rock, was a single black, tactical glove. It was identical to the ones I was wearing. The leather was worn in the same places. A small scuff mark on the knuckle was a perfect match for the one on my right hand. I stared at it, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. I looked down at my hands. Both were still gloved. My spare set was zipped tight in a specific pouch on my pack, a pouch I hadn't opened since I left the truck. With a trembling hand, I unclipped my pack and lowered it to the ground. My fingers fumbled with the zipper on the gear pouch. I tore it open. My spare headlamp was there, my extra batteries, my emergency kit. But the small, sealed bag containing my spare gloves was empty. It hadn't just mimicked me, it had touched me. It had reached into my pack, into my personal, secured space, and taken something. The violation was more profound than any ghost story. This thing was interacting with my world, manipulating physical objects with a silent, impossible precision. The glove wasn't just a clue, it was a message. I know you. I can get to you. I can touch you whenever I want. That was it. My resolve shattered. Logic had no place here. Procedure was a joke. I abandoned my multi-$1,000 pack where it lay. I needed to be faster, lighter. My only goal was the pinprick of gray daylight that felt a lifetime away. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the wet stone. The cave came alive with sound. A cacophony of mimicry erupted from the darkness around me. Ethan's screams, my wife's pleas, my captain's orders, the sound of the falling rock, the whisper of my own voice, all swirled together in a terrifying symphony of my own experience. It was as if the cave was inhaling my life and exhaling it as a weapon against me. The sounds followed me, chasing me through the narrowing passages, always just a few feet behind, a wave of pure psychological torment. I ran blindly, not caring about the path, just moving towards the faintest hint of fresher air. My lungs burned. My legs ached. Finally, I saw it. The entrance, a jagged mouth of hope against the deep, absolute black. I sprinted the last 50 yards and burst out into the dreary afternoon, collapsing onto my hands and knees on the damp soil, gasping the cool, pine, scented air of the living world. The silence was deafening. The birds, the wind, the normal, natural sounds of the forest rushed back in, washing away the phantom echoes. I stayed there for several minutes, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was out. I was safe. After my breathing returned to something resembling normal, I pushed myself up and turned to look back at the cave. I expected something, I don't know what. A shape in the darkness, a final taunting whisper. But there was nothing. Just a black, empty hole in the side of a hill. It looked dormant, ordinary. But I knew what was inside. My hand went to my radio, my fingers hovering over the transmit button. What would I say? Base, this is Ledger. I've made contact with an echo. The cave it talks. They would think I'd lost my mind. They'd pull me from active duty. My career would be over. But as I stood there, trembling, a final, horrifying thought took root. The entity had followed my trail in, mimicked my thoughts, and stolen my glove. It knew my path. It knew my voice. It knew my memories. What was to stop it from following me out? The hike back to my truck was the longest mile of my life. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The familiar forest, my place of work and solace, now felt alien and menacing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half, expecting to see a shimmering distortion in the air, or a shadow that moved against the light. My hand never strayed far from the radio on my shoulder, but my thumb never pressed the button. What could I report? The truth was career suicide. A lie felt like a betrayal of Ethan Hayes and any future victim of that thing. By the time I reached the command post, a temporary city of tents and vehicles at the edge of the park, I had cobbled together a story. It was a weak, flimsy thing, but it was grounded in a reality they would understand. I reported that the cave system was dangerously unstable. I mentioned the dead end, the lack of any further signs of passage, and fabricated a minor rockfall near the crawl space to justify my hasty retreat and abandoned pack. I recommended, in the strongest possible terms, that no further attempts be made to explore that specific cave. The risk of collapse, I argued, was too high. It was a coffin waiting to be sealed. My report was met with tired nods. No one questioned the decorated SAR officer with 15 years of experience. My word was enough. The search for Ethan Hayes was officially redirected, focusing on more remote areas of the surface. Just in case. Effort that everyone knew was futile. Within a week, the search was called off. Ethan was added to the long, sad list of those claimed by the wilderness. A press release was issued, his family grieved, and the world moved on. But I couldn't. I had closed the book on the search, but in doing so, I had opened a new, terrifying chapter in my own life. I had left my pack in that cave, a totem of my identity, and I feared I had brought something else back with me in its place. The first few weeks were deceptively quiet. I threw myself into my work, taking every shift I could, desperate to exhaust myself into a dreamless sleep. My wife, Sarah, tried to get me to talk about it. She saw the new tension in my shoulders, the way my eyes would dart towards the shadows in our own home. It was just a tough one, wasn't it? She'd say, her hand rubbing my back. I would just nod, unable to give voice to the impossible truth. How could I tell the woman I loved that I was being haunted by a sound, that a cave knew my name? The first incident happened about a month after the search. I was sitting in my study, trying to read. The house was quiet. Sarah was out with friends. Then, from the hallway, I heard it. Quinn. It was Sarah's voice, clear as day, a gentle, questioning call. I stood up, my heart pounding. Sarah, I thought you were out. I walked into the hallway. It was empty. The house was still. Her car keys were gone from the hook by the door. I was alone. It was the cave. It had followed me. After that, the occurrences became more frequent, more personal. It started to use sounds from my life. One evening, I heard the distinct sound of my father's old Zippo lighter flicking open, a sound I hadn't heard since he passed away a decade ago. Another time, I heard the faint, happy bark of a beagle we had lost years prior. These weren't just random noises, they were surgical strikes against my sanity, crafted from the fabric of my own memory and loss. The entity was no longer just a mimic, it was a psychological tormentor, an artist painting with my grief. Sleep offered no escape. I was plagued by nightmares of being trapped in suffocating darkness, with voices whispering from all around me. They were the voices of everyone I had ever failed to save, a chorus of the lost, with Ethan Hayes' desperate cries for help leading the macabre choir. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my own scream caught in my throat, the phantom sounds still ringing in my ears. I grew gaunt, hollow-eyed. I stopped eating. I stopped talking. I was becoming a ghost in my own home. Sarah knew something was deeply wrong. Our home, once a sanctuary, had become a place of tension and fear. Talk to me, Quinn. She begged one night, her eyes full of tears. Whatever this is, we can face it together. I looked at her, at this woman I loved more than life itself, and I felt a wave of protective terror. I couldn't tell her. The thing fed on emotion, on memory. To tell her would be to give it more ammunition. To tell her would be to put her in its line of fire. It knew her name, her voice. What else could it learn if it knew I loved her? The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 3 months to the day I had entered that cave. I was home alone, staring out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The house was silent except for the drumming of the storm. Then a new sound started. It was quiet at first, coming from the upstairs nursery we had packed up years ago after a miscarriage. It was the sound of a baby crying. It was a weak, pitiful sound, and it ripped through me with a physical pain. It was the cruelest cut of all. I stumbled up the stairs, my legs weak, my mind screaming at me that it wasn't real, that it was a trick. I threw open the door to the nursery. The room was dark, filled with boxes. And for a fleeting second in the corner of the room, I saw a shape. It was a column of deeper darkness, a shifting, formless void that seemed to absorb the light around it. As my eyes focused, the crying stopped, and a new voice whispered from the shape, a perfect copy of my own. We could have saved him. A guttural roar of pure rage and grief tore from my throat. This thing had crossed a line. It had worn the face of my duty, stolen the voices of my loved ones, and now it was desecrating the memory of my deepest sorrow. It wasn't just haunting me, it was trying to erase me, to replace me with a hollow shell of fear and regret. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my gut, but it was now joined by a white-hot, cleansing anger. This thing had taken Ethan. It was taking me. I would not let it take anything else. I would not let it have my home, my wife, my memory. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door open. I went down to the basement, to the old steel locker where I kept my decommissioned gear. My hands were steady as I pulled out my old pack, not the one I had abandoned, but its predecessor, a ghost of my former self. I began to check the equipment with a grim, methodical purpose. Ropes, carabiners, headlamp, batteries. I was no longer a man running from a ghost. I was a man preparing for a hunt. I knew I couldn't kill it. How do you kill a sound? How do you fight an echo? But I could face it. I could go back to where it lived, to its source. I would not be a victim in my own home. If I was to be haunted, it would be on my terms in its domain. I had to seal that cave. Not just on a map, but for real, with explosives, if I had to. I would bury it, silence it, and tomb it in the darkness it came from. It was a suicidal thought, a fool's errand, but it was the only thought that made sense. The next morning, before the sun rose, I kissed a sleeping Sarah goodbye. A note left on the kitchen table with words I hoped she would never have to read. I drove out to the whispering karst, the gray light of dawn breaking over the mountains. I parked my truck in the same spot as before. I stood once more at the mouth of the cave. The same cold, dead air breathed out to meet me. This time, I wasn't a rescuer. I wasn't an officer of search and rescue. I was just Quinn Ledger, a man with nothing left to lose. I shouldered my pack, switched on my headlamp, and took a deep breath. The darkness did not feel empty. It felt expectant, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped across the threshold back into the throat of the earth. From the deep black ahead, a whisper reached out to greet me, a sound of chilling, welcoming familiarity. It was my own voice. Welcome home. My name is Rackle Ravenscroft. For the last 8 years, I've served as a wildlife biologist and park ranger, a career path that has taken me from the granite peaks of the Rockies to the sun-scorched deserts of the Southwest. For the past 3 of those years, however, my home has been the Blackwater Cypress Preserve in the humid, tangled heart of the Deep South. This isn't a national park in the grand, postcard-ready sense. It's a sprawling, 80,000 acre tract of protected wetland, a primordial labyrinth of murky channels, cypress domes, and peat bogs that the modern world has largely forgotten. My job here is less about guiding tourists and more about monitoring the delicate, often unseen, life that thrives in the shadows of the ancient trees. The preserve is a place of profound, almost aggressive life. The air, thick and wet, carries the scent of decay and rebirth, of damp earth and sweet, cloying blossoms. In the summer, the drone of insects is a constant, physical presence, a sound you feel in your teeth. The water, stained the color of black tea by tannins from decaying leaves, conceals more than it reveals. It's a world of patient predators and silent swimmers, where alligators, ancient and armored, slide from muddy banks with barely a ripple, and catamouts coil on low, hanging branches indistinguishable from the gnarled wood. I respected this place. I understood its dangers in a practical, scientific way. I knew which snakes were venomous, how to read the weather in the shifting clouds, and the precise GPS coordinates of every research station and emergency cache in my sector. I was a professional, armed with data, training, and a healthy dose of professional detachment. I believed there was nothing in that swamp that couldn't be explained by biology or geology. I was wrong. My primary assignment for the past several months had been a comprehensive survey of the Barber's map turtle population, a species of special concern due to habitat fragmentation. This meant long days spent alone, navigating the winding waterways in a shallow draft John boat, its small motor sputtering softly against the overwhelming silence. I'd motor as far as I could, then anchor and wade into the shallower, less accessible backwaters. It was grueling work. The water, even in waders, was a constant, oppressive weight, and the thick, grasping mud could suck a boot right off your foot if you weren't careful. But I loved it. The solitude was a balm, a stark contrast to the noise of the world outside the preserve's boundaries. In that isolation, I found a rhythm, a sense of belonging to this ancient place. The incident began on a Tuesday in late October. The oppressive heat of summer had finally broken, replaced by a cooler, though no less humid, autumn air. The mission for the day was to check a series of remote monitoring traps in the preserve's notoriously inaccessible western quadrant, an area known as the Murky Fen. It was a place even the most seasoned hunters tended to avoid, a maze of stagnant pools and cypress stands so dense they formed a canopy that the sun struggled to pierce. Even at midday, the water here was different, less a flowing channel and more a series of interconnected, still ponds coated with a film of bright green duckweed. There was an old story, a piece of local folklore the old-timers at the bait shop in town sometimes spoke of after a few beers. They talked about the Fen Mother, an entity they claimed guarded the deepest parts of the swamp. A water spirit, they'd say, their voices dropping low. They claimed it didn't take kindly to trespassers, and that more than one trapper who ventured too deep into the fen had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but an empty boat or a hat floating on the water. I'd always dismissed these tales as campfire stories, the kind of myth making common to isolated, rural communities, a way to personify the very real dangers of getting lost or succumbing to the elements in such an unforgiving environment. It was tragic, but not supernatural. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Usually, the swamp is a cacophony of life, the croaking of frogs, the chirping of crickets, the call of a distant heron. But as I pulled my boat deeper into the fen, a hush fell. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was a heavy, expectant silence. The kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. The air grew still, the water became glassy, reflecting the twisted cypress trees with perfect, unnerving clarity. I remember thinking it was odd, chalking it up to a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. I checked my compass and GPS. I was on the right course. I anchored the boat near a large, gnarled cypress and swung my legs over the side, my waders sinking into the soft, silty bottom. The water was colder here, with a strange, metallic scent I couldn't place. My objective was a small, isolated pool about 200 yards inland, a prime location for the turtle traps. As I pushed through the tangled undergrowth and knee-deep water, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was a primal, instinctual feeling, the kind our ancestors must have felt when a predator was stalking them from the tall grass. I paused, scanning the dense foliage around me, my hand resting on the handle of the large machete at my belt. I saw nothing, heard nothing. There was only the oppressive silence in the dark, unmoving trees. I reached the pool. It was a perfectly circular body of water, perhaps 50 feet across, completely surrounded by a ring of skeletal cypress knees that looked like bony fingers clawing their way out of the mud. The water was almost perfectly black and still, its surface disturbed only by the slow drift of fallen leaves. And then I saw them. At first, my brain struggled to process the image. Floating near the center of the pool were 3 objects. They weren't natural. They were effigies, woven with an eerie, intricate skill from pale river reeds. Each was about the size of a human head, vaguely spherical, but it was the material woven into them that made my blood run cold. It was hair. Long, tangled strands of human hair. I waited a few steps closer, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My scientific mind was scrambling for a rational explanation. A prank. Some backwoods art project. But this felt different. This felt ancient, ritualistic. The hair was the most horrifying part. There were different colors, strands of blonde, tangled with dark brown, woven alongside a shocking lock of vibrant red. It was undeniably human. The effigies weren't just floating randomly, they were arranged in a deliberate triangle, bobbing gently in the stagnant water, watching the silent woods with unseen eyes. A cold, creeping dread, heavier than the waterlogged waders on my legs, began to settle over me. The old-timers' stories of the Fen Mother, of people vanishing, echoed in my mind, no longer sounding like harmless folklore. This wasn't a prank. This was a shrine, or a warning. And as I stood there, knee deep in the black water, I had the sudden, terrifying certainty that I was the one being warned. For a long moment, I was paralyzed. The world seemed to shrink until it was only me, the black pool, and those horrifying floating heads. Every rational instinct, every ounce of my scientific training, screamed at me to turn around, to wade back the way I came, get in my boat, and never return to this cursed corner of the swamp. But another part of me, the part that was a ranger, a biologist, a professional, refused to yield to the terror. This was a potential crime scene. At the very least, it was something that needed to be documented, reported. My duty warred with my survival instinct, and for a terrifying second, the battle was a stalemate. With a trembling hand, I unclipped the waterproof digital camera from my belt. My fingers felt like clumsy, frozen sausages as I fumbled with the power button. The small electronic chime it made as it turned on was a bizarrely modern sound in this ancient, silent place, and it felt like a sacrilege. I raised the camera, the view screen a small, bright rectangle against the gloom. I forced myself to be methodical, wide shots of the pool and the surrounding cypress knees, medium shots of the three effigies in their triangular formation. Then I steeled myself and waded a few feet closer, the sucking mud at the bottom of the pool seeming to grasp my waders with a newfound malevolence. I zoomed in on each effigy, capturing the grotesque detail of the woven reeds and the sickeningly familiar textures of the matted human hair, the blonde, the brown, the red. My mind felt strangely detached, as if I were observing someone else taking these pictures. It was a coping mechanism, a way for my brain to process the impossible by treating it as just another data point. Once the pictures were taken, the spell of professional duty was broken, and the fear returned with a vengeance, crashing over me in a cold wave. I had to get out. Now, I turned, moving as quickly as the deep water and thick mud would allow, my movements clumsy and loud. Every splash felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition, it was a leaden certainty pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't dare look back at the pool. I was terrified that if I did, I would see a fourth head break the surface of the black water, its eyes fixed on me. The 200-yard trek back to my John boat was the longest journey of my life. The swamp, which I had always seen as a complex but neutral ecosystem, had transformed into a living, breathing entity that hated me. Every gnarled cypress root looked like a grasping claw. Every strand of Spanish moss hanging from the branches seemed to twist into a noose. The metallic scent I had noticed earlier was stronger now, and I could taste it on the back of my tongue. The coppery tang of old blood. I heard a sound then, a soft, wet plop from somewhere to my right. I froze, my head snapping in that direction, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. Was it just a turtle sliding off a log? Or was it something else? Something that had been waiting for me to turn my back? I saw nothing but the dense, dark foliage. I didn't wait to find out. I scrambled the rest of the way, half wading, half falling until I saw the welcome, solid shape of my boat. I practically threw myself over the gunwale, landing in a heap on the metal floor. My hands shook so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the motor's ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life, shattering the unholy silence. I didn't bother pulling up the anchor. I grabbed my machete and hacked at the rope until it parted, leaving the anchor behind as a small sacrifice to the fen. I slammed the throttle to full, and the boat shot forward, leaving a churning wake in the tea-colored water. I didn't slow down, and I didn't look back until I was miles away, back in the main channel where the sun felt warm on my skin, and the familiar sounds of birds and insects had returned. Back at the ranger station, I stormed into the office of my supervisor, Frank Henderson. Frank was a man who seemed to be carved from the same tough, weathered cypress as the trees in the preserve. He'd been a ranger for 30 years and had a deeply ingrained skepticism for anything that couldn't be caught, tagged, or explained away by the weather. He was listening to a weather report on an old radio, a half-empty mug of coffee in his hand. "Frank, you're not going to believe this," I said, my voice still shaky. I was covered in mud and sweat, my eyes wide. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Try me, Ravenscroft. Don't tell me you found another tourist trying to wrestle a gator for a selfie. No, worse. I found something in the murky fen. A shrine or something. Effigies. Made of reeds and human hair." I pulled out my camera and showed him the pictures. He leaned forward, squinting at the small screen, his brow furrowed. He swiped through the images, his expression unreadable. When he was done, he leaned back in his creaky chair and looked at me, not at the photos. "Probably just some local kids," he said, his tone dismissive. "Or maybe some folks practicing their, what do you call it? Wicca stuff. We get all kinds out here. Kids. Frank, look at the craftsmanship. And the hair. This wasn't kids. This was something else. It felt wrong. The whole area was dead silent. It's the Fen Rakul. It's always quiet back there. It's spooky. That's why people tell stories about it. Your mind plays tricks on you." He waved a hand at the camera. "Delete the photos. We start a panic over some spooky trash. We'll have every conspiracy nut from 3 states crawling all over the preserve. We don't have the manpower for that. You were there to check the turtle traps, right? So check the traps and forget about this." I left his office, my anger warring with my fear. He hadn't believed me, or he didn't want to. It was easier to dismiss it as a prank than to confront the alternative. But I couldn't forget it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of those effigies were burned into my mind. Frank's dismissal only strengthened my resolve. If he wouldn't investigate, I would. The station's records room was a small, dusty office filled with old filing cabinets. I started pulling files on every reported disappearance within the preserve or the surrounding counties going back 50 years. The official explanations were predictable: hikers lost to the elements, boaters who likely drowned, hunters who had accidents. But as I read through the decades of cold cases, a pattern began to emerge. A disproportionate number of the vanished had last been seen heading towards the western quadrant, towards the murky fen. Then I found it, a file from 1988, a missing college student, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins who had been an avid birdwatcher. The report included a photograph. She had long, beautiful blonde hair. My blood went cold. I kept digging. A report from 2003, a fisherman, a tourist from up north, who disappeared from his boat. His wife's statement described him as having dark, almost black hair. And then the one that made me gasp out loud. A case from just 6 years ago. A teenage girl, a local runaway named Amy Clark, who was last seen near the edge of the preserve. Her distinguishing feature, noted in the report and highlighted in a school picture, was her fiery red hair, blonde-brown. Red. It wasn't a coincidence. My hand was shaking as I lined up the photographs of the missing people next to the pictures I had taken of the effigies on my camera. It was them. Those weren't just effigies. They were trophies, grave markers. The Fen Mother wasn't just a story. It was a killer, and it had been collecting souvenirs for decades. Frank was wrong. The old-timers at the bait shop were right. And I was the first person in years to stumble upon its lair. My fear was now eclipsed by a chilling realization. I had found the final resting place of the lost, and the thing that put them there now knew my name. Sleep offered no escape. It was a suffocating, dreamless void that I fell into, only to be violently ejected back into consciousness by the thunder of my own heart. The faces from the missing persons files, Sarah, Amy, the unnamed fisherman, were seared onto the backs of my eyelids. They weren't just case files anymore. They were people stolen from the world and imprisoned in that stagnant black water. Frank's dismissal in the cold, bureaucratic language of the reports felt like a second layer of violation. The official story was that they were gone. The truth, The horrifying supernatural truth was that they had been taken, and the thing that took them knew I had seen its trophies. A cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach, displacing the fear. I couldn't call the police. What would I say? That a local ghost story was real and was collecting human hair for its arts and crafts projects. They would think I was insane, or worse, somehow involved. Frank had already made his position clear, bury it. But I couldn't. I was a ranger. My duty was to protect the preserve and the people in it. More than that, I was now a witness. To walk away would be to condemn those souls to be forgotten forever, and to allow the next victim to unknowingly walk into that monster's embrace. I was on my own. If I wanted answers, if I wanted justice for the lost, I had to go back. But I wouldn't go back as a biologist. I was going back as a hunter. The next 48 hours were a blur of grim preparation. I told Frank I was taking a few personal days, citing exhaustion. He grunted his approval, clearly happy to have the spooky trash incident behind him. I used the time to assemble a new kind of field kit. I kept my machete and my sidearm, a standard issue Glock, but I added to the arsenal. At a marine supply store an hour away, I bought a high-powered flare gun and a dozen military-grade magnesium flares. My reasoning was simple. If this thing was a creature of water and shadow, its antithesis would be fire and light. In a dusty corner of the station's maintenance shed, I found what I was looking for, a heavy, duty grappling hook attached to 100 feet of thick nylon rope. I was going to retrieve that evidence one way or another. My final stop was the town's tiny, neglected library. I spent hours poring over brittle books of local history and folklore, searching for any mention, any myth that might give me an edge. Most of it was useless, but I found one passage in a self-published book from the 1950s that made my blood run cold. It spoke of a woman of the bog who could not be killed by normal means, for she was not truly alive. She was an elemental, a creature of mud and memory. But the legend claimed she had a weakness. She could not abide the clean fire, and she feared the cold iron of man, which could unmake what the earth had made. My flare gun felt a little heavier in my pack. The grappling hook, forged from steel, now felt less like a tool and more like a weapon. I set out before dawn on the third day, under the cloak of a moonless, overcast sky. The air was unnaturally still as I launched my boat, the familiar sputter of the motor sounding like a profane intrusion into a sacred space. This time, as I motored towards the western quadrant, the swamp didn't just feel silent, it felt hostile. The journey was a nightmarish parody of my usual route. A large alligator, bigger than any I had ever seen, surfaced alongside my boat and paced me for almost a mile, its ancient, reptilian eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intelligence before it sank silently beneath the black water. A flock of crows, hundreds of them, sat in the skeletal branches of a dead cypress, watching me pass in dead silence, a sea of glittering black eyes. The preserve was no longer a neutral wilderness. It was the creature's lair, and I was an invader. I cut the engine sooner this time, pulling the last half mile into the murky fen. The silence was absolute. I anchored the boat and slipped over the side, the cold of the water a familiar shock. As I waded towards the hidden pool, the coppery scent of old blood was stronger than ever, a nauseating miasma that clung to the humid air. I pushed aside a final curtain of Spanish moss and stopped dead. The pool was as I remembered it, a circle of black glass reflecting the gray sky. The three effigies were still there, bobbing gently, but they weren't alone. Floating in the center of the triangle, in the place of honor, was a fourth effigy. It was newer than the others, the reeds still faintly green. Woven into it, unmistakable and horrifying, were long strands of dark brown hair. My hair, from the branch I must have snagged during my panicked escape. A welcoming gift. A low, pitched hum began to emanate from the water itself, a vibration I felt in the bones of my feet. The surface of the pool, previously still, began to bubble, not with swamp gas, but with a thick, viscous ooze. The water darkened, churning as if something immense were stirring in the depths. Then, it began to rise. It wasn't an animal. It was a shape, a mockery of a human form coalescing from the mud, the weeds and the black water itself. It was tall and slender, its limbs long and misshapen, its body a constantly shifting mass of filth and decay. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless head that tilted towards me. And then 2 points of pale, phosphorescent green light ignited within the shapeless mass, fixing on me. They were eyes. Eyes filled with an ancient, implacable hatred. The fen mother had come to greet me. It raised a long, dripping arm, and a tendril of mud and vine shot out towards me like a whip. I reacted on pure instinct, diving sideways into the murky water as the tendril cracked where I had been standing. I came up sputtering, my heart hammering against my ribs, and scrambled for my pack. I tore the flare gun from its holster, my hands shaking but my mind icily clear. As the creature reformed itself, gathering its substance for another attack, I aimed the gun at its center mass and pulled the trigger. The whoosh of the flare was deafening. The magnesium ignited with the brilliance of a falling star, bathing the dark fen in a searing, white, hot light. The creature shrieked, a sound that was not of this world, a chorus of rushing water, tearing roots, and the screams of 100 drowning voices. It recoiled from the light, its form sizzling and dissolving where the intense heat touched it. The clean fire. It was real. I didn't waste the opportunity. As the creature thrashed in agony, I unslung the grappling hook, swung it once, and let it fly. The iron hook sailed true, snagging the knot of effigies. I planted my feet, pulling on the rope with all my strength. They were heavier than they looked, waterlogged and unnaturally dense. I dragged them through the water towards me, my eyes never leaving the wounded creature. It was already beginning to pull itself back together, its hateful green eyes dimming but still fixed on me. I hauled the grotesque trophies onto the muddy bank, grabbed the rope, and ran. I didn't look back. I fled through the grasping trees and the sucking mud, not stopping until I was back in my boat, hacking through the anchor rope for the second and final time, and speeding away from that cursed place, leaving the shrieking of the fen mother to fade behind me. I never went back to the ranger station. I drove for 6 hours straight, all the way to the state capitol. I walked into the headquarters of the State Bureau of Investigation, muddy, exhausted, and carrying a dripping evidence bag. The troopers on duty looked at me like I was crazy, until I emptied the bag onto their counter. I told them everything, leaving out nothing. I knew how it sounded, but the hair in those effigies, once tested, would tell its own story. The DNA would match the cold cases. Sarah Jenkins, Amy Clark, and a dozen others would finally be found. I resigned from the Park Service the next day. I couldn't go back. I had faced the primordial darkness that lurked in the heart of the preserve, and I had, by some miracle, survived. I had pulled its secrets into the light. But I knew, with a certainty that would haunt me for the rest of my days, that I hadn't killed it. The fen mother was wounded, but not destroyed. It was still there in its black pool, formless and ancient and patient. And I know that sometimes, when the water rises and the fog hangs low over the cypress trees, it remembers the one who fought back, the one who stole its trophies. And I am sure, in the darkest hours of the night, that it is weaving a new effigy, waiting for the day it can finish its collection. My name is Elodie Youngblood, and for the past 7 years, I've had the privilege of calling the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the Anza, Borrego Desert State Park, my office. As a park ranger, you become intimately familiar with the land you protect. You learn its moods, its rhythms, its subtle language spoken in the rustle of a brittle bush or the shadow of a hawk against a canyon wall. You develop a kind of sixth sense, an instinctual hum that tells you when things are right with the world, and more importantly, when they're not. I've rescued dehydrated hikers, tracked elusive bighorn sheep, and spent more nights under a canopy of stars than I have under a plaster ceiling. I've faced flash floods, blistering heat waves, and the occasional disgruntled rattlesnake. I thought I understood the desert's dangers. I was wrong. My story, the one that matters, the one that still wakes me up with a throat raw from screaming, begins on a Tuesday in late September. The air was already thick, with the kind of heat that feels heavy, a physical weight on your shoulders. I was assigned to trail maintenance in the calcite mine area, a remote and labyrinthine network of canyons carved by ancient water flows. It's a geologist's dream, a maze of mustard, yellow sandstone, siltstone, and dramatic slot canyons that narrow so tightly you have to turn sideways to squeeze through. For a ranger working alone, it's a place that demands respect. You don't get careless out there. You check your gear twice, carry more water than you think you'll need, and you always let dispatch know your exact route and expected check-in times. I did all of those things. It didn't matter. The task for the day was simple: clear fallen rock from a section of the main trail, reinforce a few trail markers that had been weathered loose, and generally ensure the path was safe for the coming tourist season. It was meditative work. The rhythmic clink of my rock hammer against stone, the scrape of my boots on gravel. These were the only sounds in a world that seemed to hold its breath. The silence of the desert isn't an absence of sound, it's a presence. It's a vast, profound quiet that presses in on you, amplifying the beat of your own heart. By midday, the sun was a merciless white disk directly overhead, bleaching the color from the sky. I took a long drink from my canteen, the lukewarm water tasting like life itself, and scanned the canyon rim. Nothing. No birds, no lizards skittering for shade. The usual desert cast of characters was conspicuously absent. That was the first prickle of unease, a tiny dissonant note in the desert symphony. I dismissed it. Animals are smart. They were likely hunkered down in cooler burrows and crevices, waiting out the worst of the heat. I went back to work. My focus narrowed to the task at hand. It was around 200 p.m. when the air began to change. The oppressive stillness broke, but not with the familiar sigh of a coming breeze. This was different. A low, almost sub-audible hum vibrated through the soles of my boots. The sky to the east, which had been a flawless pale blue, was now stained with a sickly yellow, brown haze that was expanding with unnatural speed. It wasn't a dust devil, those whimsical desert tornadoes that dance across the flats. This was a wall, solid and menacing, churning as it advanced. My training kicked in instantly. Localized sandstorm. Seek immediate shelter. I radioed dispatch. Ranger Youngblood to base. I have a visual on an unexpected, fast-moving weather system in the calcite mine area. It looks like a severe sandstorm. I'm aborting my maintenance work and seeking shelter in a canyon overhang. Over. The reply was staticky, broken. Pete, Ranger, Arbold. Dispatch. I'm caught in a sandstorm. I repeated, shouting over a sudden, violent gust of wind that sandblasted my face.
Seeking shelter now!
The wall of sand hit the canyon with the force of a tidal wave. The world vanished. One moment I was in a wide, sunlit canyon. The next, I was in a suffocating, churning vortex of brown. Visibility dropped to nothing. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. The sun was gone, the sky was gone, the canyon walls were gone. It was like being buried alive in a roaring cloud. The wind howled, a physical shriek that tore at my clothes and forced its way into my ears, my nose, my mouth. I pulled my bandana up over my face, tasting grit, and pressed myself against what I hoped was the solid rock of the canyon wall. This is when the sound started. At first, I thought it was the wind, its voice distorted as it ripped through the narrow slot canyons and over sharp rock formations. But as I huddled there, blind and disoriented, I began to discern a pattern beneath the chaos. It was a sound that was both high and low, a guttural, throaty growl that would inexplicably pitch up into a reedy whistle. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the scream of a mountain lion. It wasn't animalistic, not in any way I recognized. The sound seemed to come from the wind itself, carried on the billions of grains of sand that were scoring the world clean. It was everywhere at once, inside my head and all around me. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the adrenaline. I tried to reason with it. It's just the wind. Acoustics are strange in these canyons, but my ranger's instinct, that sixth sense I had trusted for 7 years, was screaming that this was wrong. Then the ground shuddered. Not a tremor like an earthquake, but a deep, resonant groan from the rock I was leaning against. Small pebbles rained down on my hard hat. The storm was getting worse, the wind pressure building to an impossible degree. The guttural sounds intensified, a chorus of them now seeming to swirl around me in the blinding chaos. I felt a terrifying sense of being watched, of being surrounded. Another shudder, more violent this time. A large rock dislodged from somewhere above, crashing nearby with a sickening thud that I felt more than heard. The canyon was unstable. The storm wasn't just passing through, it was attacking the very rock around me. Panic set in. Staying put was a death sentence. I had to move to find a more stable overhang, a deeper cave, anything. Blindly, I pushed off the wall and took a step. My boot met only air. My stomach lurched as I tumbled forward, not onto a flat trail, but down a steep, sandy slope that hadn't been there moments before. The ground was collapsing, eroding away in the furious wind. I slid, clawing uselessly at the shifting sand, as the roaring wind and the horrible, guttural whispers escorted me down into a deeper, narrower part of the canyon I didn't recognize. I came to a jarring halt against a pile of fallen rock, my ankle twisting painfully beneath me. I lay there for a moment, stunned, gasping in the thick, dusty air. The storm raged on, a maelstrom of sand and sound. But the immediate, terrifying truth of my situation was clear. I was lost. I was injured. And I was trapped in a collapsing canyon, being hunted by a sound I couldn't identify. The desert I thought I knew had turned on me, and it was showing me a face of horror I never knew it possessed. The real nightmare had just begun. Time lost all meaning in the roaring darkness. I don't know if I lay there for 10 minutes or an hour, pinned by pain and terror. My world was a chaos of stinging sand, the shriek of the wind, and those monstrous, guttural sounds that seemed to scrape against the inside of my skull. Then, as unnaturally as it began, the storm started to recede. The deafening roar softened to a hiss, the physical pressure of the wind eased, and the thick, brown fog began to thin. A pale, ghostly light filtered down from above, revealing a world remade. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm itself. It was a dead silence, heavy and suffocating. The air was thick with fine dust that coated my tongue and lungs. I pushed myself up, a searing pain shooting from my ankle up my leg. I looked down. My boot was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark, ugly swelling was already straining against the leather. A quick, agonizing diagnosis confirmed it a bad sprain, possibly a fracture. My heart sank. In the desert, mobility is life. I was now critically compromised. My first rational thought was my radio. I fumbled for it on my belt, my fingers trembling. The plastic casing was cracked, and the antenna was snapped off. I mashed the transmit button, my voice a raw croak. Ranger Youngblood to dispatch. Can anyone read me? Over. Nothing. Not even static. It was a dead piece of plastic. The fall had destroyed it. I was truly alone, cut off. Panic, cold and oily, tried to rise in my throat, but I choked it down. Panic is the enemy. Assess, adapt, survive, the mantra of every ranger drilled into us until it became instinct. I did a quick inventory. My backpack was still strapped to me, a small miracle. Inside, I had 1.5 canteens of water left, maybe a day's supply if I was brutally disciplined. My first aid kit was intact, as was my multi-tool, a length of rope, and my emergency rations. My rock hammer was gone, lost in the fall. I was injured, isolated, and with dwindling supplies, but I wasn't helpless. Not yet. I finally allowed myself to take in my new surroundings. I was in a place I had never seen before. The storm hadn't just trapped me. It had excavated a new canyon, or perhaps uncovered an ancient one. The walls were impossibly smooth, scarred clean by the sandstorm, and they rose vertically on either side, far too high and sheer to climb, even with 2 good feet. The rock itself was different from the familiar yellow sandstone of the calcite mine area. This was a darker, almost bruised purple stone, shot through with veins of a glistening, black mineral that seemed to absorb the weak light. The canyon floor was a narrow, winding path of deep, soft sand, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The way I had fallen was a steep, impassable slide of loose rock and sand. There was no going back. There was only one way to go: forward. The guttural growls of the storm were gone, but the air was not entirely silent. A faint, high-pitched sound lingered, a thin, reedy whistle. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, consistent. An inhale, a pause, a long, whistling exhale. It sounded disturbingly like breathing, amplified and distorted by the strange acoustics of the canyon. It was coming from deeper within the winding passage. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay put, to build a shelter and wait for a rescue that I knew, logically, might be weeks away if ever. They would search my planned route first. No one would think to look for a canyon that didn't exist on any map, but the whistling sound, it pulled at me. It was both terrifying and strangely compelling. Was it the source of the sounds from the storm? Was it a natural phenomenon, some bizarre geological feature, or was it something else? The feeling of being watched returned, 10 times stronger in the dead quiet. I felt like a mouse in a maze, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something was waiting at the end. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I unlaced my boot and used bandages and splints from my first aid kit to immobilize my ankle as best I could. It was a clumsy job, but it provided a small measure of stability. I found a long, flattish piece of fallen rock that could serve as a crude crutch and hauled myself to my feet. Every movement was agony. Taking my first step was an act of pure will. I began to limp my way forward, deeper into the canyon's throat, toward the source of the whistling. The walls seemed to press in on me as I moved. After about 20 yards, I saw them, markings, scratched into the dark, polished stone. At first, I thought they were natural fissures, but as I got closer, I saw the deliberate, savage artistry. They weren't the pictographs of the native Kumeyaay people. I knew those symbols well. These were violent, deep gouges in the rock, sets of 3 parallel lines, sometimes straight, sometimes arsing. They looked like claw marks, but no animal I knew of could leave gashes that deep and solid rock. They were everywhere, from the floor to as high as I could see. Some old and weathered, others shockingly fresh, with fine rock dust still settled in the grooves. It was a territorial marking, and it was recent. The whistling grew louder, the rhythm faster, more agitated. It was as if my presence was disturbing it. The air grew colder, the light dimmer as the canyon twisted and narrowed. I had to turn sideways to squeeze through one section, the cold, marked rock scraping against my back. I felt a profound claustrophobic dread. This wasn't a place of nature. It felt like a tomb, a trap. After what felt like an eternity of painful shuffling, the narrow passage opened abruptly into a small, circular chamber, perhaps 50 feet across. The whistling was loud here, seeming to echo from all around, its source still maddeningly unclear. But it was the contents of the chamber that made my blood run cold and my breath catch in my throat. The center of the sandy floor was a junkyard of human tragedy. I saw the tattered remains of a modern hiking backpack, its nylon fabric shredded to ribbons. A single, splintered trekking pole lay half buried in the sand. Strips of brightly colored technical fabric, pieces of jackets and pants, were scattered about like grim confetti. And then I saw the bones. They were unmistakably human. A femur shattered at one end, a piece of a pelvis. Several ribs cracked and broken. They were old, bleached white by the sun that only briefly touched this place. But they weren't broken the way bones break in a fall. They were splintered, gnawed, with deep grooves that matched the claw-like markings on the walls. This was a den, a larder. For years, maybe decades, hikers who wandered off the trail, who got lost in the labyrinthine canyons, had ended up here. They weren't missing persons. They were prey. I stared in utter, paralyzing horror. My mind struggled to process it. What kind of creature could do this? What lived in these canyons, hidden from the world? My ranger's knowledge, my understanding of the desert ecosystem, was useless. This was something other, something ancient and unknown. And as that terrible realization dawned on me, the rhythmic, whistling breath stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was a physical blow. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing. Then, from the deep, absolute darkness of a wide crevice on the far side of the chamber, a sound I had heard before rumbled into the quiet. It was the low, guttural growl from the storm, no longer distorted by the wind, but clear, wet, and hungry. It was impossibly close. I had not just stumbled into its territory. I had walked right into its home. Fight, flight, or freeze. In the face of mortal terror, the human brain offers you three choices. For a frozen eternity that lasted maybe a single second, my mind chose to freeze. I stood rooted to the sand, my gaze locked on the pitch, black crevice from which that wet, predatory growl had emanated. My carefully constructed ranger training, my mantras of survival, all of it evaporated, leaving only raw animal fear. Then it began to emerge. It wasn't a sudden rush. It unfolded from the darkness, a slow, deliberate movement that was profoundly unsettling. Two long, impossibly thin limbs, the color of bleached bone, and knobbed at the joints like a spider's legs, scraped against the rock as they found purchase. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Then the head appeared, and my sanity almost fractured. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but elongated and hairless, with skin that looked thin and translucent, pulled taut over a skull of jutting angles. It had no visible eyes, only two deep, dark pits where they should have been. Its mouth was a wide, lipless slit that stretched too far across its face, and as it opened, it emitted that whistling sound, the sound of its breathing, now punctuated by a low, clicking sound from deep within its throat. It was the source of the storm's chorus, the voice in the wind. The creature hauled the rest of its body into the faint light. It was emaciated, its ribs starkly visible beneath its pale skin. Its limbs were too long for its torso, and it moved in a low crouch, its arms ending not in hands, but in three long, curving talons of the same black, glistening mineral veining the canyon walls. They were part of its body, grown from bone. These were the things that had carved the walls and shattered the bones of the dead. It swiveled its head, the dark pits of its sockets seeming to stare right through me, and the growl rumbled in its chest again, deeper this time. It knew I was there. It could smell me. It could feel the vibration of my terrified heartbeat through the sand. That's when my brain finally chose flight. The spell of terror broke. With a strangled sob, I spun around and ran. Or rather, I hobbled, lurched, and scrambled, my makeshift crutch digging into the soft sand, my shattered ankle screaming in protest. Adrenaline was afire in my veins, momentarily numbing the worst of the pain. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound behind me told me everything I needed to know. The scrape of rock-hard talons on stone, faster now, and the horrible, whistling breath. Eager and excited, it was hunting. I plunged back into the narrow passage I'd come from, the claustrophobia that had terrified me moments before, now feeling like my only hope. If I could just make it through the tightest squeeze, maybe it wouldn't be able to follow. The walls pressed in, the dark stone cold against my shoulders. I threw my crutch ahead of me and half crawled, half pulled myself through the narrowest point, the rough rock tearing at my clothes. I burst out the other side, gasping, and risked a glance behind me. A bone, white, three-taloned hand was reaching into the squeeze, its claws gouging deep new furrows in the purple rock, trying to gain purchase, trying to pull its grotesque body through. It was too big. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought I was safe. But then the creature emitted a high-pitched shriek, a sound of pure frustration and rage that vibrated in my teeth. It withdrew its arm, and I heard a horrific cracking, splintering sound from within the passage. It wasn't trying to squeeze through. It was breaking the canyon itself. Renewed terror gave my legs a strength I didn't know they had. I snatched up my crutch and fled, limping desperately down the winding corridor. The canyon was a maze, and I was running blind, praying each twist and turn wouldn't lead to a dead end. Behind me, the sound of destruction was a constant, terrifying drumbeat. Huge cracks echoed through the stone as the creature smashed its way through the narrow passage. It would be free in moments. My lungs burned. My ankle was a nexus of pure agony. I knew I couldn't keep this up. I needed a weapon, an advantage. My mind raced, flicking through the inventory of my pack. Rope, multi-tool, water, useless. Then my fingers brushed against the small, hard rectangle of my emergency rations. An idea. born of sheer desperation, flashed in my mind. It was insane. It would probably get me killed. But it was better than being run down and torn apart in the dark. I rounded a sharp bend and saw a relatively straight section of canyon ahead, maybe 40 feet long. It was now or never. I ripped open my backpack, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper. I grabbed the length of rope and my multi-tool. I looped one end of the rope around a sharp outcrop of rock near the floor, then hobbled as fast as I could to the other side of the canyon, paying out the rope. I pulled it taut, about 6 inches off the ground, a crude, desperate tripwire. There was no time to be clever. I heard it coming, its heavy, scraping footsteps echoing, getting closer. I fumbled with the multi-tool, flicking out the small, sharp blade. It looked like a toothpick against the coming nightmare. I backed away from my trap, pressing myself into a shallow alcove in the canyon wall, trying to make myself small, trying to stop the ragged, loud gasps of my own breathing. It appeared at the far end of the corridor, a pale horror moving with a loping, terrifying grace. It didn't even seem to see the rope. It was focused on me, the dark pits of its face locked onto my position. It lunged, covering the ground with impossible speed. My heart stopped. It's too fast, it's going to leap over it. But it didn't. Its spindly front leg caught the rope. Its forward momentum was too great, its gait too awkward. With a shriek that was a mix of surprise and fury, the creature was thrown off balance. It didn't just trip, it crashed, its brittle, looking limbs flailing as its full weight came down on the canyon floor with a sickening, wet crunch. I didn't wait to see if it was injured. I burst from my hiding place, the multi-tool clutched in my hand. I didn't run toward it. I ran past it. For one horrifying, close-up second, its eyeless face was turned toward me, its leapless mouth wide in a silent scream, a smell like ozone and rotting meat washing over me. I didn't hesitate. As I scrambled past, I lunged and drove the tiny, pathetic blade of the multi-tool into the dark, soft, looking pit of its left socket. It was like stabbing a rotten melon. The blade sank into the hilt. The shriek it released was no longer a sound. It was a weapon, a physical force of pure, concentrated agony that slammed into me, throwing me back against the canyon wall. My ears rang and the world went gray. The creature thrashed on the ground, its talons tearing at its own face, ripping the multi-tool free in a spray of thick, black ichor. It ignored me completely, consumed by its own pain. That was my chance. My only chance. I staggered to my feet and ran. I ran from the unholy shrieking, from the place of bones, from the canyon that should not be. I don't know how far I went. My mind was a blur of pain and terror. I just knew I had to keep moving, putting distance between me and that thing. I ran until my ankle finally gave out completely, and I collapsed in the soft sand, unable to take another step. I lay there waiting for the scraping of talons, for the whistling breath. But there was only silence, and then a different sound, a gentle breeze. I looked up. Above me, the narrow strip of sky wasn't pale anymore. It was a deep, brilliant blue. And on my face, I felt the warmth of the setting sun. Somehow I had made it out. The twisting canyon had led me back to the real world. I was miles from where I started, but I was alive. Rescue crews found me 2 days later, severely dehydrated, delirious, suffering from a compound fracture in my ankle. I told them my story, all of it. They listened patiently, then wrote it off as a hallucination, a story my trauma-ravaged mind had invented to cope with getting lost and injured in a flash sandstorm. They said the calcite mine area was searched top to bottom. There was no new canyon, no cave of bones, no creature. They found my discarded rock crutch, but my trip rope and my multi-tool embedded in the skull of a monster were never recovered. I don't work as a ranger anymore. My ankle never healed right, but that's not the reason. The reason is I can't stand the silence of the desert now. I can't stand the wind. Because sometimes, when it blows just right, I can almost hear a faint, high-pitched whistle on the breeze. And I know that the canyon is still there, hidden under the sand, and the thing I blinded is still there too, waiting. And it remembers my scent. My name is Chance Whittaker. For the past 3 summers, I've been employed by the U.S. Forest Service as a seasonal fire lookout. My post is the Arium, a small one-room cabin encased in glass, perched precariously atop the granite fang of Devil's Tooth Peak. At just over 9,000 feet, it's one of the most isolated lookouts in the state. The nearest paved road is a 2-hour hike and a 40-minute drive away. Up here, my only companions are the wind, the marmots that sunbathe on the rocks below, and the disembodied voices that crackle to life over the radio. The job is, for the most part, an exercise in solitude and observation. It is long periods of profound quiet punctuated by moments of procedural diligence. Every 15 minutes, from sunup to sundown, I scan the vast, undulating sea of green and gray that stretches to the horizon. I use the Osborne Fire Finder, a magnificent brass instrument of a bygone era, to pinpoint the location of any smoke I might see. I report my observations, check the weather, maintain my equipment, and write in the logbook. It is a simple monastic existence, one that I have come to cherish. The silence of the high alpine doesn't feel empty. It feels full, ancient, and alive. It cleanses the soul in a way the noise of the city never could. The first month of this season had been uneventful. A dry spring meant a high fire danger, but so far, the forests had remained quiet. My days fell into a comfortable rhythm. I would wake before dawn, watch the sun paint the eastern sky in hues of orange and pink, brew coffee on my small propane stove, and begin my watch. I read books, sketched the jagged peaks that surrounded me, and watched thunderstorms brew and dissipate miles away. The loneliness that drives some lookouts mad was, for me, a welcome balm. I felt a sense of ownership, of guardianship over this immense wilderness. The unsettling feeling began on a Tuesday in late July. The day was crystal clear, with none of the usual afternoon haze. The visibility was extraordinary. Through my binoculars, I could make out individual trees on mountains 10 miles away. It was during my 1400 scan that I first saw him. He was on the Serpent Spine, a notoriously treacherous RT that connected Devil's Tooth to the next major peak. It's a knife, edge ridge with sheer drop, offs on either side, a place climbers with experience and proper gear might tackle, but not a place for a casual hiker. He was about 1.5 miles away, standing on a section of the ridge that offered no discernible path or purpose. At first, I felt a jolt of concern, a lost hiker, perhaps. I focused my binoculars, expecting to see someone waving their arms, a sign of distress. But he was perfectly still, dressed in dark, practical clothing, dark pants and a dark jacket. He blended in with the gray rock and gnarled, wind-beaten pines. He was just standing there, facing my direction. I watched him for a solid 5 minutes. He didn't move a muscle. It was unnatural. Hikers rest, they adjust their packs, they take photos. This man was a statue. I radioed it in, following procedure. Eerie to dispatch, over. The familiar voice of Sarah, the dispatcher, crackled back. Go for dispatch, Eerie. How's the view? Clear and quiet, Sarah, but I've got a visual on an individual on the Serpent Spine. Section 7, Niner. Appears to be stationary. I can't tell if they're in distress. Over. There was a pause. I could hear the faint rustle of papers on her end. 10-4, Eerie. Serpent Spine. That's no place for a picnic. Is it one of the climbing teams we know about? Negative, dispatch. Appears to be a single individual. No climbing gear visible from my position. He's just standing there facing the tower. Over. All right, Chance. Keep an eye on him. Let me know if his situation changes. Maybe he's just an ambitious photographer. Dispatch clear. I said I would, but a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. A photographer would have a tripod, a camera. This man had nothing. I kept my binoculars trained on him. An hour passed, then another. He remained in the exact same spot, a silent, unmoving sentinel. The sun began its slow descent towards the western peaks, and the shadows in the canyons deepened. The initial concern I had felt was slowly being replaced by a creeping dread. This was no hiker. This was no photographer. Why would anyone stand on a dangerous, exposed ridge for hours on end, doing nothing? The only logical conclusion was that his purpose for being there was to watch me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I raised the binoculars again, my hands slick with sweat. I zoomed in as far as the optics would allow, the image becoming grainy. I could just make out his form. And then I saw it, a tiny glint of light reflecting the afternoon sun. It was a reflection from a lens. He had his own set of binoculars, and they were pointed directly at me. The vast, comforting wilderness suddenly felt like a cage. My glass-walled cabin, my sanctuary, was now a display case. I was the exhibit. I felt a primal urge to hide, to duck below the windows and crawl into a corner. But my job was to watch, so I watched him watch me. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep twilight blue. The temperature dropped. The wind, a constant companion, moaned as it swirled around the tower. I couldn't take my eyes off the ridge. The figure was a silhouette now, a black cutout against the dying light. Surely he would leave now. He couldn't possibly navigate the serpent's spine in the dark. It would be suicide. But he didn't leave. As the last vestiges of light vanished, and the stars began to pepper the inky blackness, the silhouette remained. I could no longer see him clearly, but I knew he was there. I could feel his presence across the chasm, a malevolent focus aimed squarely at me. The radio was silent. The world was silent, save for the wind. I was alone on top of a mountain, trapped in a glass box, with a stranger watching me from the darkness. The first night of my terror had begun. Sleep was an impossibility. The thin mattress on my cot, which had always felt like a welcoming comfort after a long day, now felt like a slab in a morgue. Every creak of the old tower, every gust of wind that rattled the window panes, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. For hours, I lay in the oppressive darkness, my body rigid, my ears straining to catch any sound that was out of place. The silence between the howls of wind was even worse. It was a heavy, listening silence, and I felt as though the void itself was holding its breath, waiting. My gaze was fixed on the wall of windows facing the serpent's spine. I couldn't see anything but my own faint reflection in the glass, a pale, haunted face suspended in the blackness. But I knew he was out there. The certainty of it was a physical weight, a pressure on my chest that made each breath a conscious effort. My mind raced, concocting 100 different scenarios, each more terrifying than the last.
Who was he? What did he want?
Was this some kind of sick game? Or was he a genuine threat, patiently waiting for the right moment? The isolation that I had once found so liberating now felt like a fatal vulnerability. There was no one to call for help, no one to hear me scream. The radio was my only link to the outside world, but what could I say? There's a man on a ridge looking at me, and I'm scared. Sarah's voice, usually a comfort, would be filled with professional concern, but she was miles away. They would think I was cracking under the solitude, another lookout succumbing to cabin fever. I felt a profound, chilling loneliness that had nothing to do with being physically alone. As the first hint of gray light began to dilute the eastern sky, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost brought me to my knees. I scrambled from the cot, my hands shaking as I grabbed my binoculars. With the dawn came a sliver of hope that the night had been a fever dream, a figment of my overactive imagination. I pointed the lenses at the serpent's spine, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He was gone. The ridge was empty, a jagged line of cold, dead rock against the growing light. I scanned every inch of it, from one end to the other, zooming in on every rock and scraggly tree. There was nothing. Just the raw, indifferent beauty of the mountains. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. Maybe he was just a strange wanderer who had camped in a bizarre spot and moved on before sunrise. The thought was comforting, a life raft in a sea of fear. I forced myself into my morning routine, moving with a stiff, unnatural precision. I made coffee, the familiar ritual feeling alien and pointless. I did my 0700 radio check in, my voice sounding strained and hoarse to my own ears. Eerie to dispatch, over. Morning, chance. Sarah's voice chirped. Sleep well. The question was so mundane, so normal, it almost made me laugh. Like a log, I lied. Dispatch, the individual I reported on the spine yesterday, appears to have moved on. No sign of him this morning. Over. 10-4. Eerie. See. Told you he was probably just a photographer. Glad he didn't try to navigate that ridge in the dark. Dispatch clear. Her casual dismissal should have been reassuring, but it only amplified my sense of isolation. I was on my own with this. The day wore on, a pale imitation of my normal, peaceful existence. I tried to read, but the words blurred together. I tried to sketch, but my hand trembled. Every 15 minutes, I did my scans, my eyes lingering far too long on the empty space on the serpent's spine. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill, but the coldness inside me remained. By midday, I was running low on fresh water. The supply came from a small, hand-pumped well and a collection cistern about 100 yards down the trail from the base of my tower. The short journey, which I usually enjoyed, now felt like a journey into enemy territory. Leaving the relative safety of the glass, walled Eerie felt like shedding my armor, but I had no choice. Before I left, I scanned the entire visible landscape for a full 10 minutes. The forest was still. The only movement was a hawk circling on the thermals high above. My tower stood on a granite outcrop, and the trail wound down through a small cluster of fir and pine trees before reaching the well. It was a path I had walked hundreds of times, with my rifle slung over my shoulder, a precaution I had rarely felt the need for before, and 2 large canteens. I locked the tower door behind me and started down the stone steps that were carved into the rock. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the breeze, made me flinch. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on my back. The 100-yard walk felt like miles. I reached the small clearing with the well, my senses on high alert. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. And then I saw it. Sitting directly on top of the cast iron pump handle was a small object. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of pale wood, maybe pine or aspen. It was no bigger than my thumb. The knife marks were fresh, the edges still sharp. It hadn't been there the day before. It was a message. My blood ran cold. The man on the ridge wasn't just on the ridge. He had been here. Right here, 100 yards from where I slept. He had crept up to my tower in the dead of night or the gray light of dawn and left this token. This proof of his proximity, the illusion of distance, the mile and a half of empty space between us was shattered. He could get close. He could move through this wilderness without a sound, without a trace, except for what he wanted me to find. I snatched the wooden bird, my fingers closing around it. It felt obscene. I looked wildly around the clearing, into the deep shadows between the trees. Was he watching me now? I filled my canteens in a frantic rush, my hands clumsy, spilling water down the front of my pants. I didn't care. I turned and practically ran back up the trail, my lungs burning, my mind screaming. Back inside the area, I slammed the door and threw the bolt. I stood there, panting, my back pressed against the wood, the small carved bird clutched in my fist. I was no longer just being watched. I was being hunted. This wasn't a random event. It was a deliberate, calculated campaign of psychological terror. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of pure fear. The forest I had loved was now a menacing curtain that could be hiding anything. I didn't see him all day. I scanned the serpent's spine, the surrounding slopes, the tree lines, till my eyes ached. Nothing. The emptiness was almost worse than his presence. It meant he could be anywhere. As the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape, I felt a new kind of dread. The dread of a second night. I was preparing myself for another long, sleepless vigil when my routine scan brought me to a ridge closer than the serpent's spine, to the west of my tower. It was a lower, more wooded ridge, one I didn't pay as much attention to. And there he was. Partially obscured by the trunk of a large pine, he stood in the gathering dusk. He was closer now, maybe less than a mile away. He was still dressed in dark clothing, still unnaturally motionless. As I watched, breathless, he raised his arm. I saw the familiar glint of a binocular lens catch the last rays of the dying sun. He had moved. He had systematically chosen a new position, one that was significantly closer to my lonely perch. The sun disappeared. The light began to fail, and I knew, with a certainty that froze the very marrow of my bones, that this was his pattern. He was a predator circling his prey, tightening the noose with each passing day. The first night had been terrifying. This one I knew would be infinitely worse. The second night was a descent into a waking nightmare. I didn't even bother with the cot. I spent the hours wedged into the corner of the cabin farthest from the new position of my tormentor, my rifle held tight across my chest. The wind screeched like a banshee, and this time my mind played new tricks on me. In the lulls between gusts, I began to hear things, or perhaps I imagined them. A faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from one of the windows. Tap, 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 like a fingernail on glass. Then a low scraping sound from below, the screech of metal on rock, as if someone were testing the steel legs that held my cabin aloft over the chasm. I would lurch to my feet, my heart seizing, and peer wildly into the impenetrable blackness. I saw nothing. I heard nothing but the pounding of my own blood in my ears. Was he down there, climbing the tower's support structure in the dark? Was he outside my door? The logical part of my brain, the small, frightened part that was still rational, told me it was impossible. The climb would be treacherous, and the wind alone could peel him from the steel girders. But logic had no place here anymore. This man operated outside the bounds of reason. He was a force of pure, silent malice, and the fear he generated was a physical entity, filling the small cabin until I could barely breathe. I thought about the radio. I could press the button, scream for help, but the words still wouldn't come. The image of Sarah's concerned but disbelieving face, the thought of a search party being sent out for a spooked lookout, kept me silent. He had isolated me not just physically, but mentally. He had made my own fear a cage. When dawn finally broke, it wasn't a reprieve, it was a deadline. The gray light revealed the western ridge to be empty. He was gone again, but I knew the pattern now. Today he would move closer. Where would he appear at dusk? At the edge of the tree line near the well? At the base of the tower itself? I couldn't bear the thought of a third night. I couldn't let him get any closer. The game was over. I had to run. My movements were feverish, driven by a desperate, animalistic survival instinct. I stuffed a few protein bars, my map, a compass, and a full canteen into my day pack. I left everything else. My books, my sketches, my life in the eerie, it all meant nothing. I put the small, carved wooden bird in my pocket. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof. Maybe I needed a physical reminder that this was real, that I wasn't going insane. At 0800, I grabbed the radio handset, my palm so sweaty it almost slipped off. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to control the tremor in my voice. Eerie to dispatch, over. Got you, Eerie. Everything okay? Sarah's voice was a jarring intrusion of normality. Yeah, everything's fine, Sarah. Listen, I'm not feeling well. I think I came down with something, a stomach bug. Maybe. I'm going to have to hike out. Over. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. There was a pause. I could feel her weighing my words. Are you sure you're up for the hike, Chance? It's a long way down if you're sick. We could arrange for a pickup tomorrow. Negative, dispatch. I need to get down today. I'll take it slow. I just want to get to my truck and get to a real bed. I'll be fine. I'm locking up now. Expect me at the trailhead parking lot around 1400s. Over. Setting a deadline was a gamble, but a necessary one. If I didn't show up, if I didn't call to confirm I was out, they would have to come looking. It was the only insurance policy I could think of. All right, Chance. Take it easy. Keep your radio on channel 2 in case you need anything. Let us know when you're down safely. Dispatch clear. Eerie clear. I threw the handset down. That was it. No going back. I took one last look around the glass room that had been my sanctuary and was now my prison. I unbolted the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. The wind was relentless, whipping at my clothes. I locked the heavy door behind me and started down the stone steps for the last time. The 100-yard walk to the main trail was the longest of my life. I felt his eyes on me from every shadow, every tree. When I reached the place where the path to the well branched off, my blood froze. There was another carving. It sat on a flat rock right in the middle of the trail. This one was larger, more detailed. It was a crude figurine of a man, arms at its sides, featureless. A lookout. Me. My stomach churned. He knew I was leaving. He had anticipated my move. He was waiting for me. My head snapped up, and I scanned the trees ahead. The path wound downward into a dense stand of lodgepole pines. It was dark in there, the canopy blocking out most of the morning sun. He was in there. Somewhere in those woods, between me and the safety of the trailhead, he was waiting. Turning back was not an option. The tower was a death trap. Staying put was suicide. The only way was forward. Clutching my rifle so tightly my knuckles were white, I stepped past the carved figure and entered the woods. The temperature dropped immediately. The sound of the wind was muffled by the thick branches, replaced by an unnerving silence. My boots crunched on pine needles and dirt, the sound deafeningly loud. Every few steps, I would stop, listening, trying to pierce the gloom with my eyes. The forest felt ancient and hostile. I had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I heard it. A single, sharp snap of a twig breaking. It came from somewhere off to my left, deeper in the woods. It was too clean, too deliberate to be an animal. I froze, my rifle flying to my shoulder, my body screaming with tension. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice a pathetic croak. Silence. I started moving again, faster now, my heart hammering. I broke into a clumsy jog, my pack bouncing on my back. The trail was steep and rocky here, and I nearly twisted my ankle twice. I didn't care. I just had to get out. Another sound, a rustle of brush, this time closer and behind me. He was following me, shadowing me through the trees. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. I plunged down the trail, branches whipping at my face, my lungs on fire. The forest was a green and brown blur. Fear gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I finally burst out of the dense woods into a more open, sun-dappled area of aspens. The trailhead couldn't be more than a couple of miles away now. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The trail behind me was empty, but then I saw him. He wasn't on the trail. He was moving parallel to it, a dark shape flitting between the white trunks of the aspen trees. He was effortlessly keeping pace with me, a predator herding its prey. He wasn't even hurrying. I screamed then, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. I turned and ran blindly, no longer following the path, just crashing through the undergrowth, desperate to escape. I finally stumbled into the clearing for the trailhead parking lot. It was empty. My old pickup truck sat there, a beautiful, mundane symbol of a world I was no longer a part of. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them twice. I finally got the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed the lock. As I jammed the key into the ignition, I looked at the tree line I had just emerged from. He was standing there, at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by the shadow of a large fir. He wasn't holding binoculars anymore. He was just watching me, a still, silent figure. Our eyes met across the 100 feet of dusty parking lot. I saw no expression on his face, no anger, no triumph. Just a cold, empty void. He slowly raised one hand and gave me a single, deliberate wave. It wasn't a greeting, it was a farewell. A dismissal. The engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into reverse, spun out of the parking lot, and tore down the dirt road, leaving a plume of dust in my wake. I didn't look back again. They never found him. A search team combed the area for 3 days, but found no tracks, no campsite, no sign that anyone other than me had been there at all. My story was officially recorded as a case of acute stress reaction due to isolation. They thought I had cracked. I never went back. I left the Forest Service and moved to a city, surrounding myself with the noise and anonymity of millions. But I am not safe. The wilderness is vast, but the world is small. Sometimes in a crowd, I'll see a man in dark clothing standing unnaturally still, and my blood runs cold. Every night, I check the locks on my doors and windows. And in a small, locked box in my closet, I still have 2 small, crudely carved pieces of wood. A bird and a man, they are my proof, and they are my curse. My name is Harlow Dubois, and for the past 12 years, I have served as a park ranger with a specialization in coastal patrol. My jurisdiction covers the unforgiving, beautiful, and profoundly isolated stretch of coastline known as the Archangel National Seashore. It's a place of stark contrasts, where jagged black cliffs plunge into a churning, slate gray sea, and ancient, moss-draped forests press right up to the edge of the saltwater spray. Most people who visit see the postcards, the dramatic sunsets, the colonies of puffins, the occasional migrating whale. They don't see what I see. They don't know the secrets the water keeps, or the chilling tales that are whispered like the wind through the sea caves that dot this shoreline. My job is to be the steward of this wild place, to ensure the safety of its visitors, and to patrol the line where the known world of the land meets the vast, unknowable abyss of the ocean. It's a job that requires a steady hand, a rational mind, and a deep respect for the power of nature. I've always prided myself on possessing all three. I thought I was prepared for anything this coast could throw at me. I was wrong. The day it began was a Tuesday in late October. A thick, oppressive fog had rolled in overnight, a common occurrence on the Archangel coast, but this one felt different. It was heavier, clinging to the landscape like a damp shroud and muffling all sound. Even the ceaseless roar of the surf was reduced to a distant, rhythmic sigh. My patrol that morning was a lonely one, just me and my battered but reliable Land Rover, crunching over the gravel of the coastal access road. The visibility was less than 50 feet. The towering silhouettes of ancient spruce and hemlock trees appearing and disappearing like ghosts on the edge of my headlights. My route took me to Whisperwind Cove, the most remote point in my patrol zone. It earned its name from the strange, flute-like sounds the wind makes as it funnels through a complex network of sea, carved arches and blowholes. On clear days, it's hauntingly beautiful. In the fog, it was simply haunting. I parked the Rover at the overlook, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into the damp chill. The air was thick with the smell of salt, kelp, and something else, something deeper, more primal. A briny, musky scent that reminded me of the low tide in the deepest, darkest caves. I dismissed it as a trick of the fog, my senses on edge in the disorienting grayness. Part of my routine was to scan the horizon with a pair of high, powered binoculars, checking for any vessels in distress or signs of illegal fishing. It was a pointless exercise in this soupy visibility, but routine is a comfort in a place like this. I raised the binoculars to my eyes, the cold metal a shock against my skin, and swept them across the milky void where the sea should be. Nothing. Just an impenetrable wall of gray. I was about to lower them when a shape began to resolve out of the mist. It was faint at first, a darker smudge against the lighter fog. As I watched, a slow, silent current seemed to be pushing it closer to the shore. It was a boat. My heart rate quickened, a familiar jolt of professional concern. Boats this close to the rocks at Whisperwind Cove were never a good sign. The currents here were notoriously treacherous, a swirling vortex that could drag a vessel with engine failure onto the jagged fangs of the shore in minutes. I kept the binoculars trained on it, my knuckles white. It was a fishing boat, maybe 35 or 40 feet long, a common commercial trawler for this region. It drifted sideways, wallowing in the gentle swell, its outrigger poles stark and naked against the sky. There was no smoke from its exhaust, no lights on in the cabin, no sign of life on the deck. It was a ghost ship, materializing from the fog. I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Dubois at Whisperwind Cove. I have a visual on an unresponsive fishing vessel drifting towards the shore approximately a quarter-mile north of the point. No signs of life aboard. I'm going to move to the beach for a closer look." The reply was crackly but clear. "Roger that, Harlow. Keep us updated. Coast Guard has been notified of your report. Proceed with caution." Caution was my middle name. I drove the Rover down a narrow, winding track that led to the rocky beach. The tires spun on loose shale, and the suspension groaned in protest, but it got me there. I parked as close as I dared to the tide line and got out, pulling on my heavy-duty waterproof gear. The boat was much closer now, maybe 200 yards out. It was moving faster than I'd thought, carried on the incoming tide. And it was heading for a relatively smooth, if steep, section of gravelly beach, as if guided by an unseen hand to the only place it wouldn't be immediately smashed to pieces. The 20 minutes I waited for it to ground itself for the longest of my life. The silence was absolute, save for the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The boat loomed larger and larger until, with a final, mournful groan of metal on gravel, it came to rest. It sat there, listing slightly to one side, an unnatural visitor on the desolate shore. The name on the bow was just visible through a layer of grime and sea salt pescador. I knew the boat. It was captained by a man named Al Reeser, a veteran fisherman who knew these waters better than his own face. He ran it with his 2 sons. They were seasoned, careful men, not the kind to get caught off guard by a simple engine stall. I approached the vessel slowly, my hand resting on the emergency flare gun on my hip. A useless gesture, but a comforting one. The closer I got, the more the wrongness of the situation grew. The boat wasn't damaged. Not in the way a boat that had run aground should be. There were no scrapes along the hull from hidden rocks, no shattered windows in the wheelhouse. The paint was peeling, sure, and there was rust, but it was structurally intact, except for one thing. On the port side, just above the waterline, were the holes. My mind refused to process them at first. They were massive, almost perfectly circular punctures that went clean through the thick fiberglass hull. There were 3 of them, arranged in a tight triangular pattern. Each was at least 2 feet in diameter, the edges of the fiberglass bent inwards, grotesquely peeled back like the lid of a can. The sheer force required to do that was staggering. It wasn't a collision. An impact with a rock would have shattered the hull, left a jagged, splintered mess. This was a puncture. A clean, powerful, impossible puncture. My blood ran cold. I've seen what a rogue wave can do, what a collision with a semi-submerged shipping container looks like. I've seen the damage a striking whale can inflict on a hull. This was none of those things. The edges of the holes were dark, almost charred, but when I touched the rim of the lowest one, my glove came back with a slimy, opalescent residue that smelled faintly of ammonia and deep sea decay. With a deep breath, I found a rope dangling from the rail and hauled myself aboard. The deck was eerily silent. A fishing rod was still in its holder, its line trailing into the water. In the main cabin, a half-eaten sandwich sat on a plate, a fork resting beside it. A coffee mug was half full. It was a scene of mundane life, abruptly abandoned. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No scattered equipment. Nothing was out of place, except for the complete and total absence of Al Reeser and his 2 sons. They had vanished. I walked the length of the deck, my boots echoing unnervingly in the silence. Everything was in order, the nets stowed, the ropes coiled. It was as if the crew had simply been plucked from their existence, leaving behind only the faintest of ripples. My gaze was drawn back to the puncture marks, which I could now see from the inside. The way the light filtered through them into the dark hold was sickly and strange. What in God's name had the power to punch through a boat like that? To pierce it as easily as a needle through cloth, and then to take 3 men without a trace, standing on the deck of that silent, violated ship, surrounded by the oppressive gray fog. I felt a kind of fear I had never known. It was a primal, ancient fear, the kind our ancestors must have felt staring into the darkness beyond the safety of their campfire. The rational part of my brain was screaming, trying to find a logical explanation. A piece of industrial debris, a freak military experiment, but none of it fit. My gut, the part of me that had learned to listen to the whispers of this wild coast, was telling me something else entirely. It was telling me that the musky, primordial scent on the wind wasn't a trick of the fog. It was the scent of the hunter, and the pescator was its kill. My feet felt like lead as I climbed back over the rail of the pescador and dropped onto the gravelly beach. The air in my lungs was cold and thin. I took a few stumbling steps away from the violated vessel, my mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. I had to report this officially. But what would I say? Dispatch. The crew of the pescador appears to have been eaten by a sea monster. They'd have me on administrative leave and undergoing a psychiatric evaluation before sunset. I retreated to the relative safety of my Land Rover, the engines ticking a small, mechanical comfort in the oppressive, organic silence of the cove. I picked up the radio handset, my palm slick with sweat. "Dispatch, this is Du Bois," I said, my voice hoarse. "I've boarded the vessel. It's the Pescador. There's no sign of Al Reeser or his sons. No signs of a struggle. The vessel is structurally compromised. I need the Coast Guard here for a full investigation, and you should probably notify the county sheriff about 3 missing persons." I paused, trying to find the right words. "Be advised, the damage to the hull is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not from a collision or grounding." "Understood, Harlow." The voice on the other end replied, laced with a new tone of concern. "Coast Guard cutter Steadfast is en route, ETA 40, 5 minutes. Can you describe the damage?" I took a shaky breath. "Negative. You need to see it to believe it. I'm going to secure the scene until they arrive." Before they could ask any more questions I couldn't answer, I remembered the slime. "I'm also collecting a biological sample from the hull for analysis," I added, hoping the official terminology would lend me some credibility. I grabbed a sterile sample kit from my emergency pack and walked back towards the ghost ship, my every instinct screaming at me to get in my vehicle and drive until the gas tank was empty. I carefully scraped a glob of the opalescent, foul-smelling residue into a vial, sealed it, and labeled it with the time and location. It was the only piece of physical evidence I had of the impossible. The wait for the Steadfast was agonizing. The fog seemed to press in closer, the world shrinking to just the beach, the listing wreck, and the impenetrable wall of gray. The musky, deep sea smell was still on the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the water's edge, my eyes straining to pierce the mist. Was that a ripple where there should be none, a dark shape moving just beneath the surface? I saw nothing, but I felt it. A presence, a vast, ancient consciousness aware of my tiny, insignificant intrusion. The deep thrum of the Steadfast engines was a welcome noise when it finally arrived, cutting through the fog like a promise of order and reason. The cutter anchored a safe distance offshore, and a rigid, hulled inflatable boat, our HIB, was soon speeding towards the beach, carrying 4 figures in Coast Guard uniforms. The man in the lead who jumped out as the boat hit the shore was Lieutenant Commander Thorne. He was tall, with a ramrod straight posture, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. He was by the book, and his book had no chapters on monsters. "Ranger Du Bois," he said, his voice a crisp baritone that cut through the fog. "Thorne, what have we got here?" He didn't offer a handshake. "Commander, it's a mess," I said, leading him toward the Pescador. "The boat belongs to Al Reeser. He and his 2 sons are gone." Thorne's eyes swept over the scene, professionally detached. He noted the lack of damage from grounding, his expression unreadable. Then he saw the holes. He stopped dead in his tracks, his composure finally cracking for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened. He walked closer, his team following, their own chatter dying away as they took in the sight. "My God," one of the younger officers muttered. Thorne knelt, examining the inwardly bent fiberglass, running a gloved finger along the smooth, almost cauterized edge. He looked at the perfect circular shape, then at the other 2. "What did this?" he asked, the question directed at the sky as much as at me. "I was hoping you could tell me," I replied. "It wasn't a rock. It wasn't another ship. No." Thorne agreed, standing up. "It wasn't." He spent the next hour overseeing his team as they meticulously photographed, measured, and documented every inch of the vessel. They were professionals, thorough and efficient, but they were looking for a human explanation. They talked about weapon signatures, explosive decompression, and foreign submarine activity. They theorized about some new type of torpedo or a directed energy weapon being tested illegally in these waters. It was all plausible, logical, and completely, utterly wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I gave Thorne the sample vial. "I found this residue around the edges of the holes." He took it, glanced at the slimy substance, and handed it to one of his men without a word. "Probably some kind of industrial sealant or lubricant from whatever device caused this. He said dismissively, his mind already made up. To him, this was a military problem, not a maritime mystery. They made preparations to tow the Pescador to the Coast Guard station for a more detailed analysis. As they worked, I felt a growing sense of frustration. They were looking at the pieces, but refusing to see the whole picture. They were ignoring the absolute stillness of the scene of the disappearance, the half-eaten sandwich, the fishing line still in the water. They were ignoring the smell. As the Steadfast slowly towed the crippled fishing boat away into the fog, Thorne gave me a final nod. "We'll handle it from here, Ranger. Thanks for the call. We'll be in touch if our lab turns up anything on your sample." The unspoken message was clear: go back to ticketing tourists and leave the real work to us. I was left alone on the beach once more, the silence rushing back in to fill the void left by the cutter's engines. I was dismissed, an unreliable witness to an impossible event. But I couldn't let it go. Al and his boys were gone. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that no military weapon had taken them. The next 2 days were a blur of paperwork and frustrating, circular conversations. The official report listed the Reeser men as missing, presumed lost at sea. The damage to the Pescador was officially classified as under investigation by the U.S. Coast Guard, pending analysis of unknown origin. It was a neat, tidy box for an event that defied all neatness and tidiness. Driven by a gnawing unease, I took my day off and drove inland, away from the coast, to the county's historical archive. It was a dusty, quiet place filled with the scent of old paper and wood polish, a sanctuary of recorded history. I hoped to find something, anything, an old story, a forgotten incident, that might shed some light on what I'd seen. The curator was a woman named Alara Vance, sharp-eyed and with a memory for local history that was as vast as the archive itself. I described the incident in vague terms at first, not wanting to sound like a madman. A boat found adrift, crew missing, strange damage to the hull. Alara listened patiently, her fingers steepled under her chin. "At Whisperwind Cove, you say?" she asked, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "With large circular holes." My heart skipped a beat. "Yes."
How did you know?
She didn't answer directly. Instead, she led me deep into the stacks, to a forgotten corner filled with brittle, leather-bound shipping logs and boxes of yellowed newspaper clippings. "This coast has a long memory, Ranger," she said, her voice low. "We just forget how to listen to it." For hours, she helped me sift through the past. We found stories from the 1920s of a schooner found spinning in circles, its entire crew vanished. An article from 1888 described a whaling boat discovered washed ashore, its hull pierced by some great unknown force. And then we found it. Tucked inside the personal journal of a whaler captain from 1851, a man named Jedidiah Morse, was a sketch. The ink was faded, the page brittle, but the image was terrifyingly clear. It showed a long, serpentine creature, its body covered in glistening armor like plates, coiled around a small sailing vessel. Its head was narrow, almost draconic, and its mouth was open, revealing rows of what looked like massive, interlocking spikes, teeth that were 2 feet long. It was an artist's rendition of the monster from my darkest nightmares. The creature in the drawing was in the process of punching a hole through the ship's hull with its fanged maw, a hole identical in its horrifying implication to the ones on the Pescador. Beneath the chilling drawing, Captain Morse had written a shaky, spidery script. "Saw the serpent of the cove take the Mary Ann. It sings before it strikes. God save us from the Whisperwind worm, the Whisperwind worm. The name itself felt ancient and malevolent. It sings before it strikes." The flute, like sounds that gave the cove its name. It wasn't the wind. It was a siren song, a hunting call. I left the archive late in the afternoon, my mind reeling. The world felt tilted on its axis. As I drove back towards the coast, the fog, which had briefly retreated, rolled back in, thicker and more menacing than ever. I parked at the Whisperwind Cove overlook, the place where it had all begun. I got out of my rover and stood at the cliff's edge, staring into the gray abyss. And then I heard it. It wasn't the wind whistling through the rocks. This was different. It was a low, resonant note that seemed to come from the very depths of the ocean. It was a sound that was both beautiful and profoundly disturbing, a melody that vibrated not in my ears, but deep inside my chest, in my bones. It was a song, and it was calling. The song was a physical presence. It wasn't just heard with the ears. It was felt in the marrow of my bones, a resonant vibration that threatened to shake loose my sanity. It was a melody of impossible depths, ancient and mournful, yet filled with a terrifying, predatory hunger. My mind, the rational part of me that had guided my life for 12 years on this coast, screamed at me to run. But my body was frozen, held captive by the sound. There was an alluring quality to it, a siren's promise of secrets hidden in the abyss, a lullaby that coaxed you to step closer to the edge, to lean out over the precipice, to join the song in the cold, gray water below. I felt a horrifying pull, an urge to simply walk off the cliff and let the sea take me. With a surge of pure, primal terror, I broke the spell. My legs trembled as I forced them to take a step backward, away from the edge. Then another. The song intensified, a note of displeasure now woven into its hypnotic melody. It knew it was losing me. My hand fumbled for the door handle of the Land Rover, the cold metal a grounding tether to the real, solid world. I pulled the door open, the creak of the hinges sounding like a gunshot in the unnatural stillness. I didn't get in. I couldn't turn my back on the water. Not yet. I had to see. I had to know what was making that sound. As if responding to my desire, the fog began to shift. It didn't dissipate, but rather it was pushed aside from below. The surface of the water directly in the center of the cove began to boil, churning without wind or wave. A patch of the sea, 50 yards across, grew slick and dark, the water unnaturally smooth. Then, from the center of that dark patch, it rose. First came the head, emerging from the depths with a slow, deliberate majesty that was utterly horrifying. It was larger than my Land Rover, narrow and reptilian, covered not in scales, but in what looked like interlocking plates of slick, black armor that glistened like wet obsidian. 2 eyes, huge and round like dinner plates, glowed with a faint, internal phosphorescence, a sickly yellow-green light that held no warmth, only a cold, ancient, and unnervous intelligence. They blinked slowly, vertical slits for pupils narrowing as they adjusted to the air. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, arrow-like head built for moving through the water with terrifying speed. The musky, briny scent of decay I had smelled on the pescador now washed over me in a suffocating wave. The creature's long, serpentine neck, as thick as an ancient tree trunk, continued to rise from the water, lifting the head 20, then 30, then 40 feet into the air. It swiveled its head, surveying the cove, its domain. This was the whisperwind worm from Jedidiah Morse's journal, brought to life from the faded ink of a madman's sketch. It was a living relic, an impossibility that had somehow survived in the cold, dark depths off this isolated coast, a creature from an age before man. And then it opened its mouth. The source of the song was revealed not to be a throat, but the vibration of the interlocking spike, like teeth I had seen in the drawing. They were not teeth for chewing, but for piercing. Long black, needle-sharp spikes, some easily 2 feet long, that lined its jaws. As it sang, they vibrated against each other, creating the unholy, resonant melody that had lured countless sailors to their doom. Al-Reezer and his sons had heard this song. It was the last thing they ever heard. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The creature's glowing eyes, which had been scanning the empty cove, suddenly snapped towards me. It had seen me, or sensed me. The song stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I could feel its ancient consciousness focused entirely on me, a tiny, warm-blooded mammal standing on the cliff's edge. It recognized me as an intruder, an anomaly in its world. The head tilted, an almost curious gesture that was filled with an awful, alien menace. Instinct, born of pure terror, finally took over. My hand flew to my hip and unholstered the flare gun. My fingers, numb and clumsy, struggled to break it open and ensure the cartridge was seated. It felt like a child's toy against the backdrop of the monstrosity in the cove. What could a flare possibly do against a creature that could punch through the hull of a fishing boat, as if it were paper? The worm lowered its head slightly, coiling its vast neck like a snake preparing to strike. It let out a different sound now, a low, guttural hiss that vibrated the very air around me. It was a sound of pure aggression. It was going to attack. It was going to come for me. I didn't know if it could leave the water, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. With a shaking hand, I raised the flare gun, aimed it not at the creature's armored head, but at its glowing, hypnotic eye, and pulled the trigger. The thump of the discharge was followed by a brilliant, blinding flash of crimson light. The flare shot across the cove, a streak of desperate, man-made fire against the eternal gray. It struck the water just in front of the creature's face, exploding in a shower of magnesium, white sparks and thick, red smoke. For a moment, the entire cove was bathed in a hellish red glow, illuminating the full, terrifying length of the creature's exposed neck and the roiling water around it. The worm reacted instantly. It recoiled violently, pulling its head back with a shriek that was nothing like its song. This was a sound of rage and surprise, a high-pitched, metallic scream that shattered the air and sent a flock of unseen gulls crying into the fog. It wasn't hurt, I knew that. It was startled, offended. The sudden, unnatural light had broken its concentration, shattered its predatory focus. That was the only chance I was going to get. I threw myself into the Land Rover, not bothering to close the door. My hand, slick with sweat, slipped on the key twice before I managed to turn it. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gear stick into reverse, stomping on the accelerator. The tires screamed in protest, spewing gravel as I spun the wheel, swinging the vehicle's nose away from the cliff and back towards the safety of the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove, my foot pressed to the floor, the engine whining as I fled up the winding access road, away from Whisperwind Cove, leaving the fog and the song and the ancient horror behind me. I never stopped. I drove straight to my station, locked myself in my office, and sat there shaking until dawn. The next day, I put in for a transfer. My supervisor was confused but accommodating. I cited stress, personal reasons. I couldn't tell him the truth. Who would believe me? Weeks later, I got a call from Lieutenant Commander Thorne. He sounded tired. Just wanted to close the loop, Ranger, he said, his voice flat. The analysis on that sample you collected came back. It's inconclusive. Some kind of complex marine protein, but it doesn't match any known species on Earth. Probably a contaminant from a foreign vessel. The case is closed. The Pescador was likely sunk by a submarine prototype. The families have been informed. A neat, tidy box. A lie to comfort the grieving and preserve the order of things, but I knew the truth. I resigned from the Park Service a month later. I couldn't patrol that coastline anymore. I couldn't stand at the edge of the water and not think about what was looking back from the depths. I moved to the desert, as far from the ocean as I could get. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear it. A faint, deep, resonant melody on the edge of hearing. The song of the worm. And I know it's still there, in the cold, dark waters of Whisperwind Cove, guarding its secrets and waiting. It sings before it strikes. And it is always, always hungry. My name is Levy Miles, and for the better part of 15 years, I have been a sworn officer of the United States Forest Service. It is a title I hold with a quiet sense of pride. It's not a job for everyone. The solitude can be a heavy blanket, and the things you see in the deep woods, the things people do, and the things that happen to them, can carve lines into your soul that never quite fade. I have led search and rescue operations for hikers who wandered off trail and were never seen again. I have stumbled upon illicit operations hidden so deep in the pines that the air itself felt toxic. I have stood on the edge of canyons and felt the profound, humbling indifference of nature. I am by all accounts a man grounded in reality, a man who believes in maps, compasses, and the tangible evidence before his eyes. What I am about to recount challenges the very bedrock of that belief. The assignment was mundane, a piece of administrative housekeeping that falls to senior rangers like myself from time to time. It involved a multi-day inspection and inventory of an old, decommissioned ranger outpost designated STJ-04, known colloquially as St. Jude's Perch. The station had been abandoned for nearly a decade, a relic from a time when a lone ranger might be posted to a single quadrant of the forest for months on end. With budget cuts and the centralization of operations, these remote outposts had become obsolete liabilities. My job was simple: drive out there, assess the structural integrity, catalog any remaining USS property, and file a final report that would likely condemn the old place to be demolished and reclaimed by the forest. The drive alone was a lesson in isolation. It began on a familiar paved highway, then transitioned to a gravel service road that rattled the teeth in my skull. After an hour of that, I turned onto a narrow, unmarked dirt track, a line on my map that was little more than a suggestion. The towering firs and cedars closed in, their dense canopies knitting together overhead, plunging the path into a perpetual twilight. My truck's radio, which had been crackling with static for the last 20 miles, finally gave up the ghost and fell silent. The silence that replaced it was profound, a physical presence that seemed to absorb all other sounds. There was no birdsong, no rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth. There was only the crunch of my tires on the packed earth and the low rumble of the engine. It's a silence I'm used to, but this felt different. Deeper. Expectant. After another 40 minutes of careful navigation, St. Jude's Perch emerged from the gloom. It was a simple, single-story structure made of dark timber with a gently sloping roof and a wide, sagging porch. The sign bearing its name was still there, hanging crookedly from one chain. The painted letters flaked and weathered into near illegibility. It looked less like a building and more like a tombstone, a monument to a forgotten way of life. It slumped into the landscape, as if wary, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unchanging sea of trees. I parked the truck, the engine's dying cough sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. I swung my pack over my shoulder, grabbed my high-lumen flashlight and the heavy clipboard with my inspection checklist, and made my way onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight, a mournful sound that echoed in the quiet air. The front door was secured with a heavy, duty USS-issued padlock, rusted but solid. It took a moment of wrestling with the key, the metal grinding in protest, before the lock clicked open with a sharp crack. The air that rolled out from the darkness within was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of dust, decaying wood, and the faint, sour smell of mouse droppings. It was the standard perfume of abandoned places. I stepped inside, my boots scuffing on the gritty floor, and flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut a clean, white cone through the gloom, illuminating a main room that served as a living area, kitchen, and office all in one. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, a fine gray shroud that softened the hard edges of a small dining table, a pot, belly stove, and a desk covered in scattered, yellowed papers. Motes of dust danced in my flashlight beam like frantic, microscopic insects. I ran a hand over the table, leaving a clean streak in the grime. 10 years of neglect written in dust. My job was to catalog this neglect. I spent the first 2 hours in methodical, robotic work. I moved from room to room. The main area, a small bunk room with a single metal frame bed, a tiny bathroom where the toilet bowl was stained a dark brown. I took photographs, made notes on my checklist, and tagged items of value with bright orange inventory stickers. A vintage two-way radio set, a set of outdated topographical maps, a heavy wool blanket folded neatly in a footlocker. It was all predictable, all routine. The building was decaying but stable. The inventory was minimal. I could probably wrap this up in a day and a half, instead of the 3 I'd been allotted. It was as I was finishing up in the main office area that I found the logbook. It was sitting on the corner of the desk, partially obscured by a stack of moldering field guides. Unlike the other papers, it was a handsome, leather-bound volume, the USS insignia embossed on the cover. These logs were standard issue, a place for the station ranger to record daily observations, weather patterns, wildlife sightings, and any unusual occurrences. Curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know who the last soul was to call this lonely place home. I blew a cloud of dust from the cover and opened it. The first page bore a name, written in neat, strong cursive Ranger Marcus Thorne. The dates covered a 2-year period, ending almost exactly a decade ago. I sat down in the dusty desk chair, the springs squealing in protest, and began to read. For the most part, Thorne's entries were as mundane as my inspection. October 21st snow on the high peaks. Temp down to 34F at dawn. Hauled in another cord of wood. November 3V. Herd of elk passed through the meadow south of the station. Counted at least 30. Majestic sight. His entries painted a picture of a man comfortable with his own company. A man in tune with the rhythms of the forest. He was a professional, just like me. I was getting lost in the rhythm of his daily life. The sun beginning to dip below the tree line outside, casting long, distorted shadows into the room. I had the main generator off to conserve fuel, relying on my battery-powered lantern and a headlamp. It was in that growing dimness that the first odd thing happened. In the ceiling fixture above the desk, a single incandescent bulb, long dead and grayed with dust, flickered. It was a weak, anemic flash of orange light, there and gone in an instant. I froze, my hand hovering over the logbook. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. Every rational part of my brain immediately supplied an explanation. A residual charge in the old wiring. A short circuit somewhere in the system, triggered by a change in temperature or humidity. My own eyes playing tricks on me in the fading light. It was nothing. I waited, listening. The silence rushed back in thick and absolute. There was no follow-up flicker. No sound. It was nothing. I took a slow breath and dismissed it, turning my attention back to the book. But the spell of mundane routine had been broken. A tiny seed of unease had been planted. I flipped further ahead in the logbook, skipping a few months. Thorne's neat cursive started to get a little looser, the entries shorter, more pointed. He began to write less about the wildlife and more about the silence. February 21st, the quiet is different today. Heavier. Even the wind seems to be holding its breath. A week later, March 20. Haven't heard a bird in 3 days. Not one. Just the endless hum of the generator. Sometimes I think I hear things in the static on the radio, even when it's off. A chill unrelated to the evening temperature traced a path down my spine. I knew that feeling. The isolation playing tricks on your senses. You start to project sounds onto the white noise of your own existence. It's a common symptom of cabin fever. I'd felt it on long winter patrols. It was manageable. But Thorne's entries grew more specific. March 15D, it's the lights now. The spare bulbs in the storeroom. I saw one of them glow last night. Just for a second. Like a dying ember. The generator was off. I checked the wiring myself. It's impossible. I shut the book with a snap, sending a fresh puff of dust into the air. This was ridiculous. I was a veteran ranger, not some kid spooked by ghost stories. The power of suggestion was a potent force, and reading the paranoid ramblings of a man who'd been alone for too long was clearly getting to me. I stood up, stretching my stiff limbs. It was time to make dinner and turn in for the night. This place was just an old, empty building. Nothing more. I turned away from the desk, sweeping my headlamp's beam across the room towards the small kitchenette area. And as the light passed the darkened doorway leading to the short hall and the bunk room, I heard it. It was not the groan of old wood settling. It was not the wind whistling through a crack in the frame. It was a distinct, deliberate sound. A soft, dry scrape. The sound of a single boot sole shifting its weight on the dusty wooden floorboards of the empty hallway behind me. I stood there, paralyzed, my own breath caught in my throat. The beam of my headlamp trembled, fixed on the black, waiting maw of the doorway. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. I was not alone. Time ceased to have meaning. For how long I stood there, a statue carved from fear, I cannot say. Every nerve-ending screamed. Every muscle was coiled tight, ready for a fight or flight that my frozen mind refused to authorize. The beam from my headlamp, my only anchor to the tangible world, shook violently, casting dancing, distorted shadows that made the room breathe around me. The silence that followed the scraping sound was a living entity. It pressed in on my ears, a physical weight, pregnant with the promise of what might come next. My training, drilled into me over 15 years of facing the unpredictable, finally broke through the paralysis. Assess, observe, act. The mantra repeated in my head, a lifeline in a seek of terror. A squatter, a vagrant seeking shelter. Possible. A bear or a cougar. Less likely. The sound was too precise, too human. My hand, slick with a cold sweat I hadn't realized was there, drifted instinctively towards my hip, where my sidearm would normally be. It was in the locked glove box of my truck. A rookie mistake. In my haste to begin the mundane task of inventory, I had left my primary means of defense 100 feet away, across a dark and menacing porch. Who's there? My voice was a harsh croak, a sound I barely recognized as my own. It was swallowed by the oppressive quiet, leaving no echo. This is a restricted federal property. Identify yourself. The only answer was the frantic thumping of my own heart. Slowly, deliberately, I forced my legs to move. Each step was a monumental effort of will. I retrieved the heavy, 4-cell maglite from my pack, its weight a small comfort in my hand. With my headlamp pointing forward, and the powerful beam of the maglite cutting a second, wider swath of light, I approached the hallway. The dust on the floor was a perfect, undisturbed blanket of gray, save for my own footprints leading from the door to the desk. There were no other tracks. None. I swept the light into the hallway. It was short, maybe 10 feet long, ending at the closed door of the bunk room. The door to the tiny bathroom stood ajar on the left. I checked it first. The room was empty, exactly as I had left it. The stained toilet bowl, the cracked mirror, the lingering smell of decay. Nothing. My focus shifted to the bunk room door. It was closed. Had it been closed when I first walked through? I couldn't remember. The mundane details of my initial survey were a blur, erased by the adrenaline now coursing through me. My hand trembled as I reached for the cold, brass doorknob. I turned it slowly, the mechanism clicking with obscene loudness. I pushed the door inward. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the small, Spartan room. A single metal frame bed with a bare, stained mattress. A small wooden nightstand, a footlocker at the base of the bed. Everything was coated in the same thick, undisturbed layer of dust. The window on the far wall was grimy but intact. There was nowhere to hide. No one was there. I stepped into the room, my boots leaving clear, sharp prints in the dust. I looked down. My prints were the only ones. The dust was a pristine, silent witness, and its testimony was clear. No one had walked this floor in a decade. My mind raced, desperately seeking a rational foothold. A rat under the floorboards. The old building settling. My own exhausted, suggestible mind, primed by the dead Ranger's journal, manufacturing phantoms out of thin air. It had to be that. It was the only explanation that didn't shatter my understanding of the world. I was tired. I was reading a ghost story in a creepy old cabin. My brain was simply filling in the blanks. Feeling a surge of angry defiance at my own runaway fear, I strode back into the main room. I would not be chased from this place by shadows. I would assert my presence, my control. The first step was to banish the darkness. I went out to the back of the station, where the old diesel generator was housed in a small shed. It was a beast of a machine, but reliable. It took me 10 minutes of fiddling with the fuel line and a few angry pulls on the starter cord. But it roared to life with a plume of black smoke, its chugging rhythm a welcome assault against the profound silence. Back inside, I flipped the main breaker. After a moment's hesitation, the lights in the station flickered on. It wasn't the clean, steady power of the grid. The incandescent bulbs glowed with a sickly yellow light, humming and pulsing with the generator's uneven output. But it was light. The deep, menacing shadows retreated to the corners. I felt a measure of my composure return. I decided to make coffee, another small act of normalcy to reclaim my sanity. As I filled the old metal percolator with water from my canteen, it started. It began as a barely perceptible hum from the vintage 2. way radio set on the corner of the desk, the one I had tagged for inventory. It wasn't plugged in, its power cord was coiled neatly beside it. Yet, a low-level static seemed to emanate from its speaker, a faint show sound like a distant waterfall. I told myself it was sympathetic vibration from the generator. Then, the lights above the kitchenette began to flicker, not in time with the generator's rhythm, but sporadically, erratically. One bulb would dim almost to black, while its neighbor flared with impossible brightness. They danced and stuttered, casting the room in a strobe, like disorienting light. It was exactly what Thorne had described in the logbook. The lights now, and with the flickering lights came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the static from the radio, or the wind, or the generator. But it was none of those things. It was a sibilant, whispering sound that seemed to have no source. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. It slithered at the very edge of my hearing, the sound of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones, but always just too faint to make out the words. I would turn my head, trying to pinpoint the source, and the sound would shift, seeming to come from the corner I had just been looking at. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls, from inside my own head. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in my throat. This was not cabin fever. This was not my imagination. This was real. I backed away from the kitchenette, my eyes darting around the room. The whispers grew in intensity, a chorus of faint, overlapping sounds. They weren't angry or menacing. They were conversational, as if a group of people were in the room, ignoring me, carrying on with their own secret discussion. My gaze fell upon the logbook, still lying open on the desk. In that moment, it felt less like a collection of old papers and more like the key to this madness. I needed to know what happened to Thorne. I needed to know if he had heard the whispers, too. With the lights flickering wildly above me and the phantom conversation swirling in the air, I sat back down at the desk and pulled the book closer. I flipped past the entries about the lights, my hands shaking so badly it was hard to turn the pages. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the neat cursive devolving into a frantic, spiky scrawl. April 40, they talk all the time now. In the walls, they say her name. Rose. Over and over. Rose, Rose, Rose. Is she coming? Did they send her for me? April 11, see, the lights don't just flicker. They make patterns I've been watching. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. It's a code. They are trying to tell me something. I just need to figure it out. Rose would know. She always knew what the quiet things were saying. Who was Rose? His wife. A daughter. Another ranger. There was no mention of her in the official station records. Thorne had been assigned here alone. The entries became a catalog of a mind unraveling. He wrote about seeing faces in the grain of the wooden walls, about the radio speaking to him in his own voice, about leaving food out on the porch for someone who would never come. The last entry was dated April 29th, the day before he was scheduled to be relieved from his post. The handwriting was barely legible, a spider web of ink sprawling across the page, pressing so hard it had torn through in places. She's here. I saw her by the tree line. She's not cold anymore. The lights brought her back. She's whispering to me from the hallway now. She says it's time to leave the generator on. She says the others are waiting. I have to go with her. We have to be quiet now. That was it. The next page was blank. According to the official file, Ranger Marcus Thorne had abandoned his post. His truck was still here, but he was gone. They searched for weeks. They never found a body. He had simply vanished into the forest. A wave of nausea washed over me. He hadn't just gone mad from the isolation. This place had done it to him. It had whispered to him until he broke. Just as that thought solidified in my mind, the chugging roar of the generator outside sputtered, coughed, and died. The station was plunged into an instantaneous, absolute darkness. The sudden silence was a physical blow, leaving my ears ringing. I was alone in the pitch black, my heart hammering against my ribs, the last Sane Ranger's final, terrifying words echoing in my mind. And in that perfect, suffocating silence, a single, clear whisper spoke directly beside my ear. It was not the vague, ethereal hissing from before. It was crisp and cold and impossibly close, and it said my name, Livy. The word hung in the absolute darkness. A shard of ice plunged directly into my brain. Livy, it wasn't a question, it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a chilling intimacy by a voice that had no body, no source, yet was as present as the blood turning to sludge in my veins. For the second time that night, my body locked, but this was different. This wasn't the paralysis of shock, it was the reflexive recoil of a cornered animal. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped behind a wall of pure terror in my throat. I threw myself backwards, away from the sound, away from the desk. The desk chair screeched and toppled over, the crash deafening in the sudden silence that followed the whisper. My headlamp, my lifeline, was still on my head, but its beam was pointed uselessly at the ceiling as I fell, illuminating nothing but dusty cobwebs. I landed hard on my side, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I scrambled on the floor, my hands slapping against the gritty wooden planks, trying to get my feet under me. The darkness was total disorienting. Where was the door? My internal map of the room had been completely erased. The station, which minutes before had been a simple, decaying structure, was now a labyrinth, a black void designed to hold me. Get away from me. I gasped, the words barely audible. The response was immediate, not from one voice, but from the chorus. The sibilant, overlapping whispers returned, swirling through the darkness around me. But they were different now. They were clearer. They were no longer just on the edge of my hearing. They were weaving a tapestry of insidious sound. And they were using Thorne's words. But the lights brought her back, who time to leave the generator on. She's not cold anymore, Rose. Rose, Rose. No. I muttered, crawling blindly, my hands sweeping in front of me. No, you're not real. A new voice, a woman's voice, detached from the chorus. It was soft, almost gentle, yet it carried an undertone of ancient rot. He said that too. At the beginning, my hand brushed against something solid and vertical. A wall. I used it to haul myself upright, my back pressed against the cold timber. I fumbled to adjust my headlamp, my fingers feeling like clumsy, frozen sausages. The beam flickered and then steadied, cutting its familiar cone through the oppressive black. I was near the kitchenette. The front door was on the other side of the main room, a distance of maybe 30 feet that now felt like miles. I had to get out. The thought was a primal command. The clipboard, the inventory, the report, none of it mattered. Only survival. My truck keys were in my pocket. My gun was in the truck. The truck was my sanctuary. I began to edge along the wall, my shoulders scraping against the rough planks. The whispers followed me, a mobile cloud of malice. They shifted their tactics, moving on from Thorne's madness to my own life. You should have checked on your father more often. Levy, Sarah never forgave you for missing her birthday. That poor dog, waiting by the road. They were plucking memories from my mind. Things I hadn't thought about in years, twisting them into needles of guilt and fear. How could they know these things? The question itself was a trap, an invitation to the madness that had claimed Thorne. I refused to ask it. I just had to move. As I rounded the corner of the kitchenette, a bulb in the ceiling fixture directly above me flashed once, brightly. In that split second of stark, white light, I saw it. Standing in the center of the room, halfway between me and the door, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, little more than a silhouette, a distortion in the air. It was there for only an instant, but the image was burned onto my retinas. It was the shape of a man. I didn't wait to see if it would appear again. I broke away from the wall and ran, a raw, guttural cry tearing from my lungs. I bolted across the open space, my boots pounding on the floor, the beam of my headlamp bouncing wildly. The whispers rose to a shriek, a cacophony of overlapping voices screaming my name, my wife's name, my dead father's name. I reached the front door and fumbled with the knob. It wouldn't turn. It was locked from the inside, a simple deadbolt I hadn't even noticed before. My fingers, slick with sweat, slipped on the small metal latch. For a horrifying second, I thought I was trapped, that this was the end. Then my thumb found purchase, and I threw the bolt. The The click was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I yanked the door open and stumbled out onto the porch, gasping in the cold night air. The air here was clean, free of the dust and decay, and the psychic filth of the station, but I wasn't safe. The darkness under the porch roof was nearly as complete as it had been inside. The truck was a hulking, dark shape at the edge of the clearing. Behind me, from the open doorway of the station, the whispering continued, spilling out onto the porch like a foul miasma. I didn't look back. I launched myself off the porch, my ankles jarring as I landed on the hard, packed earth and sprinted for the truck. My pocket. The keys. My hand plunged into my jeans, and for a heart-stopping moment, I felt nothing but fabric. Then my fingers brushed against the cold, jagged metal. I pulled them out, my hand shaking so violently that they danced and chimed like a frantic wind chime. The driver's side door. I reached it, my breath coming in ragged sobs. I jammed the key towards the lock, missing it twice before it finally slid home. I twisted it, unlocked the door, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I was in. I was safe. But the silence in the truck was somehow worse. It felt temporary, fragile. I could still hear the whispers in my memory. My eyes were drawn to the station. Through the grime of the truck's windshield, I could see the black rectangle of the open doorway. It was a wound in the night, bleeding darkness. And then a light flickered on inside. It was in the bunk room window, the room that had been empty, the room where the dust had been undisturbed for a decade. A soft, warm, orange glow, like a candle, had been lit. It pulsed gently, rhythmically. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. It's a code. They are trying to tell me something. Thorne's words echoed in my head. I didn't want to know what it meant. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands still shaking. Come on, come on, come on, I chanted, turning the key. The engine turned over, whirring weakly. It didn't catch. Leave the generator on, the woman's voice whispered, seemingly right inside the cab with me. No, I snarled, turning the key again. The engine whined in protest. My battery was old. The cold had gotten to it. I looked at the station again. In the pulsing light of the bunkroom window, a silhouette moved past. It was indistinct, but undeniably feminine. Slender, graceful. Rose. That's when I saw the other figures. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of my truck's headlights, were shapes. At least a dozen of them, standing perfectly still, watching me. They weren't men. They were just things. Distortions in the fabric of the night. The others Thorne had written about. They were waiting. A primal surge of adrenaline, of pure, undiluted will to live, shot through me. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, flooding the engine, and twisted the key one last time with all my strength. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, the headlights flaring to their full brightness, cutting a brilliant path through the night and washing out the shapes at the tree line. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, spun the wheel, and stomped on the accelerator. The tires screamed on the dirt as I executed a frantic 3-point turn, the back of the truck nearly clipping a massive pine. I pointed the nose of the truck down the dark, narrow track I had come in on, and I floored it. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't dare. I drove with a reckless abandon I had never known, branches scraping and screeching along the sides of the truck. I drove until the dirt track became the gravel service road, and I drove until the gravel became the paved highway. I didn't slow down until I saw the first comforting glow of another vehicle's headlights. I never went back to St. Jude's Perch. I filed my report from the district office. I cited extreme structural decay and hazardous materials, the old diesel generator, and recommended immediate demolition. My superiors signed off on it without question. As far as they know, I spent 2 quiet days cataloging a derelict building. But I know the truth. I am a man of maps and compasses, a man of tangible reality. But my map has a hole in it now, a place marked. Here be monsters. I sleep with the lights on. I can't stand silence. The radio is always on. Tuned to talk radio. Anything to fill the quiet. Because sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is still, I can still hear them. They're very faint, a sibilant whisper at the very edge of my hearing. and they are still saying my name. My name is Rue Pendragon, and for the last 8 years, I have served as a Wilderness Resource Protection Officer with the U.S. Forest Service. My official title is a mouthful, so most people just stick with Park Ranger. It's a job that people romanticize. They picture you standing on a sun-drenched peak, communing with nature, a modern-day Thoreau with a government-issued paycheck. There are moments like that, fleeting and beautiful, but they are the exception. The reality is far more grueling. It's about long-haul patrols in unforgiving terrain, meticulous data collection, and enforcement actions against those who see the wilderness not as a sanctuary, but as a commodity to be plundered. My jurisdiction is the Pendelton National Forest, a sprawling 2 million acre expanse of raw, untamed land in the Pacific Northwest. It's a tapestry of ancient temperate rainforests, jagged alpine ridges, and deep, shadowed valleys carved by glaciers millennia ago. Most visitors stick to the designated trails and campgrounds near the park's southern entrance. My work, however, takes me far from the beaten path, into sectors that haven't seen a human footprint in decades, if ever. I am, for all intents and purposes, a guardian of the quiet places, the last vestiges of a world that existed long before us. My current assignment was a deep woods patrol into a sector designated on our maps as Area 7, more colloquially known among the rangers as the Whispering Spines. It's a notoriously remote and rugged chunk of wilderness, a place where the mountains seem to hunch their shoulders against the sky and the trees grow so thick they blot out the sun. For 3 weeks, my task was to conduct a comprehensive survey, specifically to investigate and document any signs of illegal logging. Recent satellite imagery had shown some canopy disturbances that couldn't be explained by natural blowdowns or wildfires. The suspicion was a ghost crew, a small, highly organized team of poachers who sneak in, cut prime old growth timber, and get out before we even know they were there. They are the bane of our existence, causing irreparable damage for a quick profit. The journey began as most of my long-haul patrols do. I was dropped by helicopter on a rocky bluff overlooking the Conifer River, the last point of easy access before the terrain dissolved into a chaotic maze of canyons and ridges. From there, it was just me, my 60-pound pack, and the immense, intimidating silence of the deep woods. The first few days were routine. I followed the faint outline of a decades-old game trail, my boots crunching on a carpet of damp moss and fallen needles. The air was cool and clean, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I saw elk grazing in a meadow, a bald eagle circling high overhead, and the flash of a trout in a crystal-clear stream. It was the kind of profound solitude that can either break a person or mend them. For me, it has always been the latter. I made meticulous notes in my field journal, documenting flora, fauna, and geological formations. I checked GPS coordinates, cross-referenced them with my topographical maps, and maintained a strict schedule. Wake at dawn, break camp, hike for 8 to 10 hours, make camp before dusk. It's a rhythm that becomes meditative after a while. The world shrinks down to the essentials: food, water, shelter, and the path ahead. It was on the 4th day that the first discordant note was struck. The forest began to change. The familiar birdsong that had been my constant companion, the cheerful chatter of chickadees, the flute-like call of a hermit thrush, faded away. An unnerving silence settled between the trees, a heavy, watchful quiet that felt unnatural. The air grew still and stagnant. I paused, scanning the canopy, listening. Nothing. Not even the hum of insects. I tried to rationalize it. A predator in the area, perhaps. A mountain lion or a bear could certainly make the smaller creatures go quiet. I unholstered the bear spray on my hip, letting my hand rest on it for a moment, and continued onward, my senses on high alert. Later that afternoon, I found the first of the strange markings. It was on a massive Douglas fir, a tree easily 500 years old. Carved, or perhaps gouged, into its thick, furrowed bark was a spiral pattern. It wasn't the work of a buck rubbing its antlers, nor did it look like any human tool mark I had ever seen. The edges of the spiral were too smooth, too perfect, almost as if the wood had grown that way. It was unsettling. I took a photo, logged the coordinates, and moved on, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. Over the next few miles, I found more. Spirals on rocks, on fallen logs, even etched into the hard-packed dirt of the trail itself. They were everywhere, a silent, cryptic sigil in the heart of the wilderness. By the morning of the 5th day, I had reached the area of the canopy disturbance indicated by the satellite data. I left the faint trail and began to bushwhack my way up a steep, thickly wooded ridge. The going was slow and arduous. The undergrowth was a thorny tangle of devil's club and salmonberry bushes. The silence persisted, deeper and more profound here than before. It felt as though I had stepped into a soundproof room. I crested the ridge, and the smell hit me first. It was a sharp, acrid odor, like a mix of ozone and rotting vegetation, with a bitter, chemical undertone that made my eyes water. And then I saw it. Below me was a small, self-contained hollow, a bowl-shaped depression in the landscape, and inside that hollow, the forest had gone mad. It wasn't logging, it was something far worse. The trees, a stand of about 30 ancient cedars, were twisted into grotesque parodies of their natural forms. Their trunks didn't rise straight and true to the sky. They contorted and coiled around each other like immense, arthritic fingers. Branches grew downwards in sharp, unnatural angles, burrowing back into the earth. The bark wasn't a healthy, fibrous red-brown. It was pale and sickly, like bruised flesh, and they were bleeding. From weeping sores and deep fissures in the twisted bark, a thick, black sap oozed and dripped onto the forest floor. It was viscous and tar, like pooling and shimmering, iridescent puddles that seemed to suck the light out of the air. The ground was stained with it. Nothing grew where it had spilled. The moss was blackened and dead, the ferns shriveled into desiccated husks. The place felt diseased, a cancer in the heart of the forest. My training kicked in, a cold, clinical response overriding my rising fear. This was an ecological anomaly, something that had to be documented. I slid my pack off and pulled out my sample kit and camera. I took wide shots of the hollow, then moved closer, my boots making a sticky, squelching sound on the contaminated ground. The acrid smell was overwhelming now, catching in the back of my throat. I approached the nearest tree, its trunk bent into a shape that resembled a human spine, complete with knobby, vertebral protrusions. I pulled on a pair of thick nitrile gloves, my duty compelling me to get a sample of the black sap. I used a sterile steel spatula to scrape a dollop of the viscous fluid into a glass vial. It was warm to the touch, even through the glove. As I sealed the vial, my foot slipped on a slick patch of sap-covered ground. I threw out my hand to steady myself, my palm slapping hard against the tree's diseased bark. I felt a sharp, stinging sensation through the glove, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking my skin. I pulled my hand back, muttering a curse. I finished my initial documentation, my mind racing. Was this a fungal blight, a chemical spill, some unknown pathogen? I needed to get these samples back to the lab as soon as possible. My mission to find loggers was forgotten, replaced by a much more urgent and disturbing mystery. I decided to take one last photo, a close-up of the bark's texture. My gloved hand was clumsy with the camera's small buttons, so, without thinking, I tugged the right glove off with my teeth and let it drop. I adjusted the lens, my bare fingers pressing against the cool metal of the camera body. I got the shot and turned to retrieve my pack, ready to leave this diseased place behind. That's when the itching started. It was on the back of my right hand, an insistent, maddening prickle. I glanced down. A small red welt was forming on my skin, right where the cuff of the glove had been. I assumed I'd been bitten by a spider or brushed against a nettle. I scratched at it, but the itch only intensified, spreading with alarming speed. It felt less like an itch and more like a burn, a fire spreading beneath my skin. I stared, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The redness was expanding, branching out from the initial point in a web of angry red lines. Within seconds, it covered the back of my hand, a painful, throbbing rash that was an exact, miniature replica of the twisted, coiling branches of the trees around me. The skin felt tight and hot, and as I watched in pure, abject horror, a single, tiny bead of thick, Black fluid, the same oily sap from the trees, pushed its way through a pore and welled up on the surface of my skin. Logic dissolved. The years of practice, rational thought that defined my career as a resource officer evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, primal panic. I stared at the bead of black fluid weeping from the pore on the back of my hand. It was glossy and viscous, identical to the sap bleeding from the twisted trees. A single, horrifying thought seared itself into my mind. It's the same. It's inside me. My first reaction was one of violent rejection. I scrambled backward, falling onto the damp earth, putting distance between myself and those diseased monoliths. I tore at my pack, fumbling frantically until my fingers found my first aid kit. They trembled so badly I could barely work the zipper. I snatched out a bottle of antiseptic and a gauze pad, pouring the clear liquid liberally over the afflicted hand. It stung like fire, but the familiar pain was a welcome sensation compared to the alien wrongness that was crawling across my skin. I scrubbed hard, rubbing my own skin raw, but the spidery, branching rash didn't fade, and the horrifying bead of black fluid, it just oozed right back out the moment I wiped it away, as if my own flesh had become a sponge saturated with the foul substance. I tried my strongest hydrocortisone cream, then an antibiotic ointment. Nothing worked. It was like trying to fight a forest fire with a child's water pistol. This affliction wasn't from a world where antiseptics and antihistamines held any sway. The pain began to escalate. It shifted from a stinging itch to a deep, profound ache. It radiated up my arm from my hand, a feeling like toxic roots were burrowing through my muscles and sinews. I looked down at my forearm in horror and saw that my veins were darkening, becoming starkly visible beneath my skin. They were no longer a healthy blue, green but a deep, bruised purple, almost black, like a network of contaminated rivers transporting this blight through my system. I had to get out, now. The mission was forgotten. The data, the survey, the search for poachers. None of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was distance from this cancerous hollow and reaching the emergency extraction point. I shoved everything back into my pack with a chaotic haste, abandoning any sense of order. I swung it onto my shoulders, the strain on my right arm making me cry out softly. I turned my back on the grotesque basin and began to hike, retracing my steps. But the forest no longer felt the same. The silence, which had been unsettling before, was now malevolent and predatory. Every snap of a twig under my boots sounded unnaturally loud. Every shadow cast by the trees seemed to wreathe into monstrous shapes. I had the distinct feeling of being watched, not by a bear or a cougar, but by the woods themselves, by every silent tree that stood witness to my decay. The pain in my arm was a constant, brutal metronome. It throbbed in time with my own frantic heartbeat. And when I risked a glance down, I had to stifle the urge to vomit. The rash I saw had spread to my elbow. The gnarled, branching pattern was becoming more pronounced, etching itself into my flesh. And most disturbingly, my skin was changing. It was losing its softness, its pliancy, becoming disturbingly hard and coarse. It felt like bark. When I flexed my fingers, I felt an unfamiliar resistance, as if my very joints were lignifying. Hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. I didn't stop to rest, to eat, to drink. I just pushed forward, propelled by sheer animal instinct. The spiral symbols I had seen earlier appeared with more frequency now, and they seemed to mock me, a taunting glyph of my fate carved into the landscape. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and orange, I knew I had to stop. I couldn't navigate in the dark in my condition. I pitched my tent with clumsy, one-handed motions. My right arm was almost useless now, a stiff and agonizingly painful appendage, and the black sap had begun to weep from the joints at my elbow and wrist, leaving sticky trails on the sleeve of my jacket. Inside, by the thin beam of my headlamp, I decided to do what I should have done hours ago. I pulled out my satellite phone, my one link to the outside world. My last hope. I keyed in the emergency number for our dispatch center and waited for the familiar chirp of a connection. Nothing. Just a flat, dead static. I looked at the screen, no signal. My heart plummeted. I tried again and again, moving around my small campsite, holding the phone up to the sky in a desperate plea. The result was the same. I was completely, utterly cut off. Help was days away on foot, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I didn't have that long. That night was pure torture. I lay in my sleeping bag, shaking with uncontrollable tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. My right arm felt like a foreign object fused to my body, radiating a heat and an agony that made sleep impossible. Whenever I did drift off, I dreamed of the twisted grove. I could feel roots stirring beneath the earth, and I could hear a whispering, like the rustle of leaves, but the words were a language of madness. I woke in the gray light of dawn with the sickening feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The pain was still there, but it was different. It was no longer a sharp, intrusive agony, but a dull, deep-seated ache, as if my body were beginning to accept the invader. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, and as the first rays of morning light pierced the open tent flap, I saw it. The transformation overnight was horrifying. My right arm was no longer recognizable as human. It had swollen to twice its normal size. The skin was hard as ironwood and fissured with deep cracks from which the black sap slowly oozed. My fingers were fused and gnarled into the shape of a twisted branch. And most terrifying of all, sprouting from the back of my hand, was a small, dark green shoot. It was a tiny, perfectly formed leaf, unfurling slowly in the morning light. A scream lodged in my throat. This wasn't an infection or a disease. This was a conversion. My body was being rewritten, terraformed into one of those abominations from the Hollow. I could feel it now, a disgusting connection to that place, a gentle but insistent pull to turn around, to go home. A wave of pure terror gave me a final surge of adrenaline. I had to fight it. I abandoned my tent and most of my gear, taking only the bare essentials: water, my remaining food, and the useless satellite phone. I needed to move faster. Every ounce of weight was the enemy. I stumbled through the forest, my misshapen right arm held awkwardly against my chest. I wasn't following a trail anymore, just moving in the general direction of the extraction point, driven by pure desperation. But the forest itself seemed to work against me. Branches snagged my clothes, roots rose up to trip me, and the silence was now broken by the whispers from my dreams. They were all around me, a susurrus on the wind, but I could hear words, or at least, my panicked mind interpreted them as words. Join us, be one. I clapped my good hand over my ear and ran, tears of frustration and pain streaming down my face. I tripped over an exposed root system and went sprawling, landing hard. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body shuddering with exhaustion. And as I lay there, looking up through the quivering leaves at the patch of visible sky, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small plane flying high overhead, a silver slash against the blue. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through me. I struggled to my feet, screaming, waving my good left arm frantically. But I was too weak. My voice was a ragged croak, and the plane was too far away. It never deviated from its course. It just flew on until it was a mere speck, and then it was gone, leaving me once more in silence. But now it was a silence filled with absolute despair. The disappearance of the plane was not a defeat. It was a verdict. It was the indifferent universe, confirming what the whispering woods already knew. I was no longer a part of that world. The last ember of hope, which had flared so desperately in my chest, was extinguished, leaving behind a cold, dense ash of despair. Lying on the forest floor, I didn't get up. There was no longer a reason to. The frantic energy that had propelled me forward, the animal will to survive, simply drained away, seeping into the soil like rainwater, and in that utter emptiness the whispers returned. They were no longer a faint chorus on the edge of hearing, but a clear, resonant hum inside my own skull. They weren't speaking a language of words, but a pure, undiluted intent. A language of root and soil, of chlorophyll and decay. It was a song of homecoming. You are hurt. You are lost. Come back. Be whole. Slowly, stiffly, I rose to my feet, not with my own volition, but as if pulled by invisible strings. The agonizing pain in my right arm had subsided, replaced by a dull, wooden numbness. I looked at the limb, at the gnarled bark skin and the perfectly formed leaf sprouting from my knuckles. It no longer seemed like a monstrous deformity. It was simply a part of me, a new part. My body turned not towards the distant hope of the extraction point, but back towards the source of my affliction, back towards the hollow. My legs, which had trembled with exhaustion only moments before, now moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. It wasn't a human walk. It was a ponderous, shuffling gait, the gait of something whose sense of time was measured in seasons, not seconds. The journey back was a strange pilgrimage. The forest that had seemed so hostile before now felt receptive. The branches that had snagged and torn at my clothes seemed to part before me. The path I had lost was now clear, not to my eyes, but to some deeper sense that was awakening within me. I could feel the presence of water deep underground. I could feel the subtle shift in the light as the sun moved across the sky, not just as sight, but as a sensation on my skin, a thirst for its energy. The leaf on my hand trembled with a faint, photosynthetic pleasure. The transformation was no longer confined to my right arm. The hard, bark-like texture was spreading across my chest and abdomen, a slow, creeping petrification. I felt a stiffness in my left hand and looked down to see the telltale branching pattern of dark veins appearing on my skin. The blight was claiming my last good limb. I felt no panic, only a placid sense of inevitability. It was like watching clouds drift across the sky. It was simply what was happening. My human thoughts began to fray, like a rope unraveling into individual fibers. Memories of my life, my apartment, the faces of my colleagues, the taste of coffee, my own name, became distant and faded, like old photographs bleached by the sun. What was a rue? The concept felt abstract, meaningless. My consciousness was simplifying, condensing down to a few core directives: move, return, root. Thirst, a primal human need, was replaced by a different kind of longing, a craving for moisture from the soil and for the light from above. I stopped at a stream, not to drink, but to plunge my transformed right hand into the cool water. The sensation was sublime, a deep, cellular quenching that my parched mouth could never have provided. I don't know if a day passed or two. Time had lost its meaning. Finally, the acrid, chemical smell of the hollow reached me. It no longer burned my nostrils. It smelled of life, of nourishment, of home. I crested the ridge and looked down into the basin of twisted, weeping trees. The sight did not inspire horror. It inspired a profound sense of belonging. They were grotesque, yes, but they were my kin. I was one of them. I had just been away. They stood in a rough circle, their contorted branches reaching for each other like the gnarled hands of old friends. And in the center of the circle, there was an empty space. A space that was waiting for me. I walked down into the hollow, my boots squelching in the black, oily sap. I did not slip. My feet felt steady anchored. I reached the center of the circle and stopped. The whispers grew into a deafening chorus of welcome, a silent symphony inside my mind. I closed my eyes. A new sensation began in the soles of my feet. Tingling, then a sharp, piercing feeling like 1,000 nails being driven up into my heels. It was not pain. It was connection. I looked down. From the bottom of my boots, thick, pale roots were sprouting, tearing through the leather and burrowing with ravenous speed into the black, contaminated earth. They drank deeply, pulling the essence of the place up into me. My legs locked, the joints fusing together. My spine straightened, then began to twist, cracking and popping as it contorted into a new, inhuman shape. My arms rose to the sides, my fingers elongating and branching, the new leaves on my left hand unfurling to join the one on my right. The last of my skin hardened and split, becoming the thick, furrowed bark of my brethren. I could feel the black sap, my blood, coursing through me, a slow, viscous life force. My head tilted back, my mouth opening in a silent scream that was not of terror, but a final, absolute transformation. The last vestiges of Rue Pendragon flickered and died. The memories, the fears, the love, the loss, all of it was scarred away by the raw, green, vegetative consciousness that flooded me. I am not Rue. I am the sentinel in the hollow. My roots run deep, intertwined with my brothers and sisters. My branches reach for the pale, filtered light. I feel the sun. I feel the rain. I feel the slow, patient turning of the world. The spirals carved into my flesh are the story of our existence, a cycle of consumption and rebirth. We watch. We wait. We hunger. And sometimes one of the fast, moving, soft-skinned creatures from the world outside wanders too close. They are drawn by the silence, by the strange beauty of our forms. And we welcome them. We teach them the song. We help them find their way home. We help them at long last to be whole.